Perhaps you have a dollar bill nearby right now. Maybe it's folded in your wallet or resting in a drawer. If you were to hold it, you'd feel its distinctive texture, that cotton linen blend worn soft by countless hands before yours. We rarely pause to consider where this familiar green rectangle came from, how it gained the power to command value across the world. And yet, the dollar is one of America's most remarkable creations, a quiet thread connecting us to revolutionaries and farmers, to presidents making difficult choices and ordinary people building an economy from scattered pieces. Tonight, we'll trace the long, winding story of how the dollar came to be. We'll travel back through centuries, past colonial chaos and wartime experiments, following the thread of American ingenuity through triumph and challenge alike. There's no need to concentrate too hard. Let the story wash over you like a gentle stream. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow your mind to drift as we explore the sleepy history of the United States dollar. Long before there was a United States dollar, before there was even a United States, the people who had become Americans were already wrestling with the practical problem of money. In the colonies scattered along the eastern seaboard of North America, from Massachusetts down through Georgia, commerce was a wonderfully chaotic affair. There was no single currency, no standardized system, no central authority declaring what should serve as money. Instead, the colonists made do with whatever came to hand, creating a patchwork economy that somehow managed to function despite its apparent disorder. The most widely used currency in colonial America was not English, though the colonies belonged to England. It was Spanish. The Spanish dollar, known formerly as the real de ocho or piece of 8, circulated throughout the colonies in vast quantities. These silver coins came from the mines of Mexico and South America, flowing north through Caribbean trade routes, and they became the backbone of colonial commerce. Each coin contained about an ounce of silver and could be physically cut into 8 wedges, or bits, for smaller transactions. 2 bits made $0.25, a phrase that has survived in American English long after the coins themselves disappeared. If you had walked through a colonial marketplace in, say, 1750, you might have conducted business in Spanish dollars, British pounds, or perhaps in wampum, those carefully crafted shell beads that indigenous peoples had used as currency for generations and that colonists had adopted for trade. You might have paid in tobacco notes if you were in Virginia, where warehouses issued certificates representing stores of the valuable crop. Or perhaps you would have bartered directly, exchanging corn for cloth, labour for lodging, in the ancient way that people have always done when metal and paper were scarce. But increasingly, the colonies were experimenting with something that would prove both revolutionary and troublesome: paper money. The first colony to issue paper currency was Massachusetts, responding to a practical crisis. In 1690, the colony had sent soldiers on an expedition to Quebec, promising them payment for their service. When the expedition returned unsuccessful, the colonial government found itself with unpaid troops and an empty treasury. The solution was to print paper notes, promises to pay backed by future tax revenue. These notes would circulate as money, accepted by merchants and citizens who trusted that the colonial government would eventually redeem them. The Massachusetts experiment succeeded well enough that other colonies followed. Pennsylvania issued paper currency beginning in 1723, using it to make loans to farmers who needed capital for their land. New York, New Jersey, the Carolinas All began printing their own money, each colony designing its own bills, setting its own denominations, backing its currency with its own promises. The bills were often beautifully designed, decorated with engravings of leaves and shells, crowned heads and colonial seals, each one a small work of art meant to inspire confidence and discourage counterfeiting. Colonial paper money served a real need. The colonies suffered from a chronic shortage of metallic currency. Gold and silver flowed back to Britain to pay for imported goods, draining the money supply. Without sufficient coins, commerce contracted, wages went unpaid, debts became impossible to settle. Paper currency, issued in carefully limited quantities, could fill this gap, providing a medium of exchange that allowed the colonial economy to grow. But here was the difficulty, the problem that would echo through American monetary history for centuries to come. The temptation to print more paper, to pay today's debts with tomorrow's promises, proved difficult for colonial governments to resist. Some colonies managed their currencies responsibly, maintaining the value of their notes through careful restraint. Others printed with abandon, issuing more and more paper until it lost its worth, merchants refusing it, prices rising as the money depreciated. The British government watched these experiments with growing unease. Parliament worried that colonial paper money, especially when it depreciated, harmed British merchants whose debts were being repaid in devalued currency. In 1764, Parliament passed the Currency Act, prohibiting the colonies from issuing paper money that could be used to pay private debts. This restriction struck at the heart of colonial commerce, removing the tool that many colonies had relied upon to keep their economies functioning. The Currency Act became one of the many grievances that built toward revolution. It was less dramatic than the Stamp Act or the tax on tea, but for colonists trying to conduct business, trying to pay workers and settle debts, the prohibition on paper money represented British interference in matters that should have been local concern. Money, it turned out, was not merely a practical matter of commerce. It was also a question of sovereignty, of who had the right to decide how value should be measured and exchange facilitated. When the Continental Congress gathered in 1775 representing 13 colonies edging toward open rebellion, it faced an immediate and pressing problem. Rebellion required resources. Soldiers needed to be paid, supplies purchased, weapons acquired. But Congress had no power to tax, no treasury, no revenue except what individual colonies might voluntarily contribute. And voluntary contributions, history repeatedly demonstrates, rarely suffice for the expenses of war. The solution was as inevitable as it was risky. Congress would issue paper money, notes that promised eventual redemption, but that would circulate immediately as currency. These bills were called Continentals, and the first issue came in June of 1775, just weeks after the battles at Lexington and Concord. The notes were denominated in Spanish dollars, that familiar colonial standard, and they bore the inscription, "The United Colonies." Later issues, as independence was declared, would say, "The United States." The Continentals were printed with care and artistry. Each note featured patriotic symbols, nature imagery drawn from the new nation's landscape, and Latin mottos suggesting strength and perseverance. But artistic beauty could not solve the fundamental problem. Congress issued Continentals not to represent gold or silver sitting in a vault, but as pure promises, backed only by the expectation that the United Colonies would eventually win their independence, establish stable governments, and levy taxes sufficient to redeem the currency. For a time the system worked tolerably well. The Continentals circulated, accepted by merchants and citizens who believed in the cause and needed a medium of exchange. But as the war dragged on, year after difficult year, Congress issued more and more currency. $2 million in 1775 became $49 million by 1779. The printing presses ran constantly, churning out bills that flooded the economy. The predictable happened. Prices began to rise as merchants recognized that the currency was losing value. A coat that cost 4 Continentals in 1776 might cost 40 by 1779 and 400 by 1780. The inflation was not sudden, not a single catastrophic collapse, but a steady erosion that gathered momentum as confidence drained away. Soldiers complained that their wages, paid in paper, could barely buy a meal. Farmers refused to sell grain for currency they expected would be worthless by spring. The phrase, "not worth a continental," entered the American language during these years, a dismissive description of something utterly without value. It was a harsh judgment, but not entirely unfair. By 1780, when Congress issued its final Continentals, the currency had lost roughly 99% of its original purchasing power. A Continental that had been worth $1 Spanish in 1775 might now require 100 to buy the same goods. This was the young nation's first extended lesson in monetary policy, and it was learned through bitter experience. Paper currency, unmoored from gold or silver, could lose value with frightening speed when issued without restraint. The printing press, that miraculous machine that could create money from paper and ink, could just as easily destroy it by producing too much. Trust, that invisible foundation on which all currency rests once lost, proved extraordinarily difficult to restore. When the war finally ended in 1783, the Articles of Confederation that governed the new nation provided no solution to the monetary chaos. Congress had the theoretical power to coin money, but no enforcement mechanism, no way to prevent individual states from issuing their own currencies or to compel anyone to accept federal money. The states operated like separate countries in many ways, each with its own paper notes, its own debts, its own monetary policy or lack thereof. Some states managed their finances responsibly, others did not. Rhode Island issued paper money so freely that its neighbours refused to accept it, merchants closing their shops rather than sell goods for depreciated bills. Debtors, who benefited from inflation that allowed them to repay loans with devalued currency, clamoured for more paper. Creditors, watching their savings evaporate, demanded sound money backed by precious metal. The economic conflicts between these groups sometimes turned violent, as in Shays's Rebellion of 1786, when debt-burdened farmers in Massachusetts took up arms against foreclosures. The monetary disorder of the 1780s convinced many thoughtful observers that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate, that a stronger federal government was needed to create order from chaos. When delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft a new constitution, monetary questions were very much on their minds. The resulting document gave Congress clear authority to coin money and regulate its value, while explicitly prohibiting states from issuing bills of credit or making anything but gold and silver legal tender for debts. The young nation was ready for something more stable, something that would restore the confidence that the continental currency had destroyed. What they needed was a unified monetary system, backed by precious metal, managed by competent hands. What they needed, though few fully understood it yet, was a national currency that could grow with the economy without losing its value. They were about to get in Alexander Hamilton, a man with the vision and determination to build such a system from the ground up. But that transformation lay just ahead, waiting in the early years of the new republic. The constitution that emerged from that hot Philadelphia summer of 1787 gave the new federal government powers that the old Congress had lacked. Among these was the clear authority to coin money, regulate its value, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Just as importantly, the Constitution prohibited states from coining money or issuing bills of credit, concentrating monetary power in federal hands. This was a deliberate choice, born from the painful lessons of the continental currency and the chaos that followed. The framers understood that a nation needed a unified currency, one system of money that could flow freely across state borders without confusion or dispute. When George Washington took office as the first president in 1789, he appointed to his cabinet a young man who would prove instrumental in building the financial foundations of the new nation. Alexander Hamilton became the first Secretary of the Treasury at age 34, and he arrived with ambitious plans. Hamilton had thought deeply about money and credit, studying the examples of Britain and other European nations. He understood that a strong economy required more than just honest currency. It needed banks, public credit, a national debt properly managed, and institutions that could mobilize capital for productive enterprise. Hamilton's vision was comprehensive, almost revolutionary for its time. He proposed that the federal government assume the war debts of the individual states, consolidating them into a single national debt. This was controversial, for some states had already paid their obligations while others had not, but Hamilton saw national assumption as essential for establishing federal creditworthiness. He proposed a national bank that could hold government deposits, issue currency, and provide stability to the financial system. And he proposed a mint that would produce coins of standardized weight and purity, giving Americans a reliable metallic currency to replace the jumble they had inherited. Not everyone agreed with Hamilton's plans. Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, envisioned a different America, one built on agriculture rather than commerce, on independent farmers rather than bankers and merchants. Jefferson worried that Hamilton's system would create dangerous concentrations of financial power, benefiting speculators and moneyed interests at the expense of ordinary citizens. The debate between Hamilton and Jefferson was not merely about banking or currency. It was about what kind of nation America would become. But Hamilton prevailed on most points through persistence, brilliance, and political manoeuvring. In 1790, Congress chartered the First Bank of the United States, a private institution with the federal government as its largest shareholder. The bank would hold government deposits, facilitate tax collection, and issue banknotes that would circulate as currency. And in 1792, Congress passed the Coinage Act, the legislation that would officially create the United States dollar as a unit of currency. The Coinage Act of 1792 was a remarkable document, precise in its specifications, ambitious in its scope. It established a decimal system for American money, a radical departure from the British tradition of pounds, shillings, and pence with their awkward ratios. $1 would equal 100 cents, a simple relationship that made calculation easier. 10 dimes made $1. 4 quarters made $1. The logic was clean, mathematical, suited to a nation that valued reason and clarity. But what exactly was a dollar? The Act defined it with careful precision. $1 would equal 371 1/4 grains of pure silver, or 24 3/4 grains of pure gold. This established a bimetallic standard, tying the dollar to both precious metals. The ratio between silver and gold was set at roughly 15:1, meaning that 15 ounces of silver had the same value as 1 ounce of gold. This ratio reflected the market prices of the metals at that time, though, as the world would discover, keeping such ratios stable would prove troublesome. The Act authorized several different coins. In gold there would be the eagle, valued at $10 and containing 247 1/2 grains of pure gold. Half eagles and quarter eagles were also specified for $5 and $2.50 respectively. In silver, the dollar itself would be coined, along with half dollars, quarter dollars, dimes, and half dimes. And for small transactions, there would be copper coins, cents, and half cents, making change for everyday purchases. The mint was established in Philadelphia, the nation's capital at that time, and it began producing coins in 1792. The first coins to emerge were copper half dimes, though some historians believe these were actually struck in silver and were more in the nature of presentation pieces than true circulation coins. The first substantial production came in 1793, when the mint produced copper cents and half cents bearing the image of liberty with flowing hair. The coins that emerged from the Philadelphia Mint in these early years were works of considerable artistry. The silver dollars, first struck in significant quantities in 1794, featured a portrait of Liberty on one side and an eagle on the reverse. Liberty was shown in profile, her hair loose and flowing, surrounded by stars representing the states of the Union. The eagle was depicted in a naturalistic style, wings spread, perched among clouds. These were America's own coins, distinctly different from the monarchical designs of Europe, celebrating republican virtue rather than royal power. But producing enough coins to meet the nation's needs proved difficult. Silver and gold had to be obtained, either by purchasing it or by accepting deposits from individuals who brought their own metal to be coined. The mint charged a small fee for this service, transforming raw silver or gold into legal tender coins. The process was slow, the machinery temperamental, the output modest. For years, Spanish dollars continued to circulate alongside American coins, accepted as legal tender by federal law. Spanish coins would not be formally demonetized until 1857, a testament to their enduring role in American commerce. The First Bank of the United States, meanwhile, was proving Hamilton's vision sound. The bank operated conservatively, maintaining substantial reserves, issuing notes that traded at face value, and providing stability to the monetary system. Its branches in major cities facilitated commerce, allowing merchants to transfer funds and obtain credit. The bank's notes, though issued by a private corporation, were backed by a mixture of specie, government bonds, and commercial loans, making them far more trustworthy than the state banknotes that also circulated. Yet opposition to the bank persisted. Jeffersonian Republicans argued that the Constitution gave Congress no explicit power to charter a corporation, that the bank represented an unconstitutional expansion of federal authority. They worried about concentrated financial power about wealthy stockholders profiting from their connection to government. When the bank's 20-year charter came up for renewal in 1811, these concerns had grown rather than diminished. Congress voted narrowly to let the charter expire, and the First Bank of the United States closed its doors. The War of 1812, fought against Britain just months after the bank's closure, revealed the costs of this decision. Without a central bank to facilitate government borrowing and manage wartime finances, the Treasury struggled. State banks, no longer constrained by competition with the national bank, issued currency with increasing freedom. The war was expensive, difficult, and revealed the fragility of a financial system built entirely on scattered state institutions. When the war ended, the case for a new national bank had become compelling, even to many who had opposed the first. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States, modelled closely on its predecessor. The Second Bank was larger, with capital of $35 million compared to the First Bank's $10 million. It had branches across the country and quickly established itself as the dominant force in American finance. The Second Bank, under the presidency of Nicholas Biddle from 1823 onward, operated with considerable skill and growing power. Biddle was an aristocratic Philadelphian, cultured and confident, who believed firmly in the bank's importance to national prosperity. The bank regulated the state banks by collecting their notes and periodically presenting them for redemption in specie, forcing the state banks to maintain adequate reserves. This discipline was necessary, Biddle argued, to prevent the kind of currency inflation that had plagued the nation before. But to the state banks and their supporters, the Second Bank's power felt like oppression, like a distant institution in Philadelphia dictating terms to local communities. The American economy in these early decades of the 19th century was growing with remarkable speed. The population expanded westward, new states joined the Union, canals and roads connected distant regions. Commerce flourished, though it remained vulnerable to periodic financial panics when credit contracted and banks failed. The monetary system functioned reasonably well, though it remained complicated. Gold and silver coins circulated alongside banknotes from hundreds of different institutions. Spanish coins still appeared in change purses decades after independence. And the question of what precisely backed the currency, what made it valuable, what made people trust it, remained somewhat mysterious even to those who used it daily. The dollar in these years was both a specific thing and an abstraction. As a gold eagle coin, it was $10 of actual metal, heavy in your hand, beautiful to see, universally accepted. As a silver dollar, it was a bit lighter, larger, still substantial and real. As a banknote from the Second Bank of the United States, it was a promise to pay, backed by the bank's reserves and reputation. As a note from a state bank, it might be worth its face value, or something less, depending on how far you were from the issuing bank and how much you trusted its soundness. This multiplicity was confusing but not unworkable. Americans learned to evaluate currency, to distinguish sound banknotes from questionable ones, to prefer certain banks and avoid others. Merchants kept lists of which banks were reliable, which notes to accept, and which to refuse. It was an education in finance that every person engaged in commerce had to acquire, a practical monetary literacy born from necessity. Andrew Jackson, who became president in 1829, brought to the office a deep suspicion of banks in general and the Second Bank in particular. Jackson was a self-made man from the frontier, a military hero who had risen through determination and force of will. He distrusted concentrated power, whether in government or finance, and he saw the second bank as a dangerous monopoly, a hydra of corruption benefiting wealthy stockholders at the expense of ordinary citizens. When Nicholas Biddle sought early recharter of the bank in 1832, 4 years before the existing charter would expire, Jackson saw it as a political challenge. He vetoed the recharter with a ringing message that denounced the bank as unconstitutional and undemocratic, an institution that granted special privileges to the few. The veto became a central issue in the presidential campaign of 1832, which Jackson won decisively. He interpreted his re-election as a mandate to destroy the bank, which he called the monster. Jackson ordered the withdrawal of federal deposits from the second bank, transferring them to selected state banks that his opponents mockingly called pet banks. This gutted the second bank's power and resources. When its charter expired in 1836, it continued briefly as a Pennsylvania chartered institution before failing entirely in 1841. The second bank of the United States, that powerful stabilizing force in American finance, was gone, not to be replaced for another 75 years. The destruction of the second bank was a watershed moment in American monetary history. It left the nation without a central financial institution, without a lender of last resort, without a mechanism for regulating the currency supply beyond the limited production of the Federal Mint. The results would be chaotic, though that chaos lay just ahead. For now, in the middle 1830s, the economy was booming, state banks were multiplying, credit was easy, and the future seemed bright. The dollar, defined in gold and silver by the Coinage Act of 1792, remained the nation's unit of account. But what that dollar actually meant, what form it took, who issued it, and who controlled it, had become more complicated than Hamilton or the framers of the Constitution might have imagined. The young nation had learned to create money, to give it form in metal and paper, to use it for building an economy. What it had not yet fully mastered was how to regulate that money, how to ensure its stability across time and distance, how to balance the need for enough currency to facilitate commerce with the danger of too much currency destroying value. These lessons would be learned slowly, through trial and considerable error in the difficult decades ahead. The era that followed the demise of the Second Bank of the United States has come to be known as the free banking era, though the name is somewhat misleading. It was not entirely free, and what freedom existed proved to be both a blessing and a source of considerable confusion. Between 1837 and 1863, banking in America operated under state rather than federal authority. Any group that could meet a state's requirements, usually by depositing bonds with the state government as security, could open a bank and issue currency. The results were as diverse as the nation itself, a monetary landscape that ranged from the admirably sound to the spectacularly questionable. At the height of the free banking era, more than 1,600 state-chartered banks issued their own banknotes. Each bank designed its own currency, choosing its own imagery, its own denominations, its own colours and artistic style. The result was a riot of paper money, bills decorated with steamboats and trains, with goddesses and presidents, with scenes of industry and agriculture. Some were beautifully engraved, miniature works of art produced by skilled craftsmen. Others were crude, almost amateurish, their design simple and their security features minimal. Imagine walking into a store in, say, 1850, carrying banknotes from a bank in Ohio. You wish to make a purchase, and you hand the merchant your money. The merchant examines the bills carefully, perhaps pulling out a thick book from beneath the counter. This book is called a banknote reporter or counterfeit detector, and it contains descriptions of hundreds or even thousands of different banknotes, listing which are genuine and reliable, which are suspicious, which are outright fraudulent. The merchant flips through the pages, trying to match your Ohio banknotes to the descriptions, checking the colour of the ink, the design of the border, the spelling of the bank's name. Even if your notes are genuine, the merchant must decide what they are worth. A banknote from a well-established bank in a major city might be accepted at face value. A note from a distant or unfamiliar bank might be discounted, accepted at 90 cents on the dollar or 80 cents, or refused entirely. The further you travelled from the bank that issued your money, the less it was likely to be worth. Distance bred uncertainty, and uncertainty bred discount. This system, for all its complications, was not entirely dysfunctional. Most banks operated honestly, maintaining adequate reserves and redeeming their notes as promised. The requirement that banks deposit bonds with state authorities provided some security, ensuring that even if a bank failed, its notes could eventually be redeemed. And the sheer variety of currency, while confusing, also represented a kind of democratic experimentation, with different states and communities trying different approaches to banking. But the system also spawned problems, some amusing in retrospect, others quite serious. The most colourful of these problems were the so-called wildcat banks. These were institutions established in remote locations, far from centres of commerce, in places where wildcats were more common than customers. The point was to make redemption difficult. If you held notes from a wildcat bank and wanted to exchange them for gold or silver, you would have to travel to some distant wilderness location, a journey that might cost more than the notes were worth. Meanwhile, the notes circulated far from their source, accepted by those who did not realize how difficult redemption would be. The term wildcat bank has endured as a description of any questionable financial institution, but the reality was more nuanced. Some wildcat banks were outright frauds, printing notes with no intention of ever redeeming them. Others were simply optimistic ventures in frontier regions, banks that issued currency before they had quite built the resources to back it properly. And many of the banks labelled as wildcats by hostile observers were actually legitimate institutions serving genuine community needs, their remoteness a result of geography rather than deception. More serious than the wildcat problem was the counterfeit problem, with 1,600 different banks issuing currency, and each bank producing multiple denominations with different designs. Keeping track of what legitimate currency looked like was nearly impossible. Counterfeiters had a field day, producing fake notes that mimicked genuine ones, or inventing entirely fictional banks with plausible-sounding names. The banknote reporters tried to keep up, listing known counterfeits alongside genuine notes, but new fakes appeared constantly. Some counterfeit notes were crude, easily spotted by anyone who examined them carefully. Others were remarkably skillful, produced by talented engravers whose artwork rivaled that of the legitimate notes. There were stories of counterfeiters who produced such excellent fakes that merchants preferred them to certain genuine notes from shabby banks. The line between money and forgery, between value and worthlessness, could be surprisingly thin. For the ordinary person trying to conduct business in this monetary landscape, life required a certain pragmatic skepticism. You learned to recognize the notes of your local banks, to trust certain institutions and avoid others. You accepted that money was not a simple, universal thing, but rather a complicated web of promises, some more reliable than others. You developed the skill of evaluating currency, judging paper and ink and engraving with a practiced eye. This was the state of American money when the nation stumbled toward its greatest crisis. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, an event that triggered the secession of Southern states, and, by April of 1861, the beginning of civil war. The war would test everything about American society, including and especially its financial system. Fighting a war required enormous resources, far beyond what the federal government could raise through taxation alone. The question of how to finance the war, how to pay soldiers and purchase supplies, would force innovations in monetary policy that would reshape the dollar forever. When the war began, the federal government's financial situation was precarious. The Treasury held limited gold reserves, and tax revenues were modest. The traditional approach to war finance had been to borrow, issuing bonds that investors would purchase with the understanding that the government would repay them with interest. But the bonds had to be attractive enough that people would buy them, and at the beginning of the war, confidence in the government's ability to win and thus to repay its debts was uncertain. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase, a former Ohio governor and senator, faced the daunting task of financing the Union war effort. Chase was a capable administrator, thoughtful and principled, though not always practical in his economic thinking. He understood that the government needed money immediately, in quantities far beyond what taxation could provide. The solution that emerged, reluctantly at first, was to issue paper currency, bills that would circulate as money, but that would not be backed by gold or silver in the traditional way. In July of 1861, Congress authorized the issuance of demand notes, a form of paper currency that could be presented to the Treasury for redemption in coin. These demand notes were a modest beginning, an attempt to provide circulating currency without fully abandoning the link to precious metal. But the war's expenses mounted quickly, and the demand notes proved insufficient. By late 1861, the Treasury was facing a crisis. Banks suspended specie payments, refusing to exchange their notes or deposits for gold and silver. The government needed a more aggressive solution. In February of 1862, Congress passed the first Legal Tender Act, legislation that would transform American money. This act authorized the Treasury to issue $150 million in United States notes, paper currency that was not backed by gold or silver reserves, but that was declared legal tender for all debts, public and private, except for customs duties and interest on government bonds. These notes were printed with green ink on the reverse side, a distinctive feature that gave them a nickname that has lasted to this day: greenbacks. The greenbacks were something new in American history, or at least something not seen since the dark days of the continental currency. They were fiat money, currency that had value because the government declared it had value, not because it represented gold or silver in a vault. The printing of greenbacks was a desperate measure, a wartime expedient, but it was also an experiment in monetary policy, a test of whether paper currency could maintain value through government decree rather than metallic backing. The greenbacks bore the portraits of American statesmen and symbols of the Union. Early issues featured Salmon Chase's own portrait. a slightly awkward bit of vanity that was nonetheless allowed. Later issues showed Abraham Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, and other figures from American history. The notes were printed in Washington at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, an institution that would grow into a major industrial operation as the demand for currency increased. Congress would authorize additional legal tender acts over the next year, eventually allowing for $450 million in greenbacks to be issued. This was an enormous sum for the time, representing perhaps $10 billion in today's purchasing power. The greenbacks circulated alongside gold coins, the old state banknotes that still existed, and various other forms of currency. But unlike gold coins, which maintained their value in the metal they contained, greenbacks could fluctuate in value, depending on confidence in the Union's prospects, and fluctuate they did. In the dark days of 1862 and 1863, when Union armies suffered defeats and the war's end seemed distant, greenbacks traded at a discount to gold. A greenback dollar might be worth only 60 cents or 70 cents in gold, meaning that prices measured in greenbacks were higher than prices measured in gold. This created a two-tier economy, with gold commanding a premium and greenbacks being the currency of everyday transactions. People hoarded gold coins, spending the greenbacks, a perfect illustration of Gresham's law, that principle which holds that bad money drives out good. But the greenbacks served their purpose. They allowed the government to pay soldiers and suppliers, to continue prosecuting the war even when tax revenues and bond sales fell short. The soldiers who fought at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, at Antietam and Chattanooga, were paid in greenbacks. The contractors who supplied uniforms and weapons and food accepted greenbacks. The currency was not perfect, but it was sufficient, and sufficiency was all that was required. Meanwhile, Congress was working on a more comprehensive reform of the banking system. The chaotic state of American currency, with thousands of different banknotes circulating, had long been recognized as a problem. The war provided both the impetus and the political will to address it. In February of 1863, Congress passed the National Banking Act, followed by a revised version in June of 1864. These acts created a system of federally chartered banks, institutions that would operate under federal supervision and issue a new, uniform currency. Under the national banking system, banks that wished to issue currency had to obtain a federal charter and deposit government bonds with the comptroller of the currency. In return, they could issue national banknotes up to 90% of the value of the bonds they had deposited. These national banknotes would be uniform in design, printed by the federal government and issued through the banks. A national banknote from a bank in Maine would look almost identical to one from a bank in California, differing only in the name of the issuing bank and perhaps minor design elements. This uniformity was the great achievement of the national banking system. No longer would merchants need thick counterfeit detector books to verify currency. The notes all looked similar, all were backed by government bonds, all could be trusted equally. The system also helped finance the war, since banks had to purchase government bonds to obtain the right to issue currency, creating a ready market for federal debt. But the national banking system did not immediately displace the old state-chartered banks and their bewildering variety of notes. State banks continued to operate, continued to issue their own currency, competing with the new national banks. To encourage conversion to the national system, Congress took a decisive step in 1865. It imposed a 10% tax on state banknotes, effectively making it unprofitable for state banks to issue currency. This tax did not force state banks to close, but it strongly incentivized them to either convert to national charters or cease issuing notes. The result was a gradual consolidation of the currency. State banknotes began to disappear from circulation, replaced by the uniform national banknotes and by greenbacks. By the end of the 1860s, the American currency supply consisted primarily of three elements: gold and silver coins, greenbacks issued directly by the Treasury, and national banknotes issued by federally chartered banks, but printed and backed by the government. It was still more complicated than a truly unified currency, but it was far simpler than the chaos of the free banking era. The Civil War had forced innovations that peacetime resistance had prevented. The greenback, born of wartime necessity, established the principle that the federal government could issue paper currency. The National Banking Acts created a system of federal oversight and uniform currency that, while imperfect, brought a degree of order to American money. These were not neat or elegant solutions. They were compromises, emergency measures that became permanent institutions, practical responses to immediate problems. But they worked after a fashion, and they moved the dollar toward greater coherence and stability. As the war ended in 1865, the Union preserved and slavery abolished. The nation turned to the question of what to do with the monetary system it had improvised under duress. Should the greenbacks remain in circulation, or should they be retired, returning the nation to a purely metallic standard? Should the national banking system be maintained, or should yet another approach be tried? These questions would dominate monetary policy for decades, creating fierce debates between those who favoured sound money backed by gold and those who advocated for easier credit through paper currency or silver coinage. The dollar's identity, its meaning and value remained unsettled, still evolving through the choices of legislators and the pressures of the economy. When the guns finally fell silent in April of 1865, the reunited nation faced questions about its monetary future that were nearly as contentious as the issues that had caused the war itself. The greenbacks, those paper dollars printed to finance the Union's survival, remained in circulation, accepted for everyday transactions but still trading at a discount to gold. Should these notes be retired, withdrawn from the economy and burned, returning the nation to a purely metallic standard where every dollar represented actual gold or silver? Or should they remain, providing flexibility and convenience that metal alone could not offer? The debate divided the country along lines that were partly economic and partly philosophical. Creditors, people who had lent money and now wanted to be repaid, generally favoured retiring the greenbacks and returning to gold. If the currency supply contracted, the value of each dollar would rise, and debts would become more burdensome for borrowers but more valuable for lenders. This was sometimes called sound money, currency backed by precious metal, stable in value, trustworthy across generations. Debtors, particularly farmers, who had borrowed to buy land or equipment, tended to favour keeping the greenbacks or even issuing more paper currency. Inflation made debts easier to repay, as wages and crop prices might rise while the amount owed remained fixed. A mortgage taken out when dollars were scarce and valuable became less burdensome when dollars were plentiful and worth less. For a farmer struggling with debt, this was not abstract economic theory. It was the difference between keeping the family farm and losing it to foreclosure. The Greenback Party emerged in the 1870s to advocate for keeping paper currency in circulation, resisting what its members saw as the tyranny of gold. The party never won the presidency, but it captured enough votes and seats in Congress to influence policy, speaking for those who felt that contraction of the currency was strangling the economy and enriching bankers at the expense of producers. Their platform was straightforward. Money should be plentiful enough to facilitate commerce, and paper currency issued by the government could provide that abundance without requiring the nation to depend on the limited supply of precious metals. Congress steered a middle course. The greenbacks were not retired entirely, but their quantity was gradually reduced, contracting the currency supply. The goal was to bring the value of greenbacks back to parity with gold, making paper and metal interchangeable. This was called resumption of specie payments, the return to a world where paper dollars could be exchanged for gold coins at face value. The Resumption Act of 1875 set a target date of January 1st, 1879, by which time the Treasury would redeem greenbacks in gold on demand. As that date approached, the Treasury accumulated gold reserves while slowly withdrawing greenbacks from circulation. It was a delicate operation, requiring careful management to avoid triggering a financial panic. When the appointed day arrived, the Treasury stood ready with $100 million in gold reserves to redeem any greenbacks that might be presented. But a curious thing happened. Because people knew the greenbacks could be redeemed for gold, hardly anyone bothered to redeem them. The paper was as good as gold, so why go to the trouble of exchanging it? Resumption succeeded precisely because it was credible. But while the greenback question was being resolved, another monetary controversy was building, one that would prove even more divisive and longer lasting. This was the question of silver, and it would dominate American politics for the next quarter century. The bimetallic standard established by the Coinage Act of 1792 had defined the dollar in terms of both gold and silver, setting a ratio between the metals. But maintaining that ratio required that the market price of silver relative to gold remain stable, and market prices, as history repeatedly demonstrates, rarely remain stable for long. Through the first half of the 19th century, silver had been slightly undervalued at the mint compared to its market price, leading people to export silver or hoard it rather than bring it to be coined. As a result, silver dollars had virtually disappeared from circulation by the 1850s. In 1873, Congress passed a new Coinage Act, revising and consolidating previous legislation. Among its many provisions was the elimination of the standard silver dollar from the list of coins to be produced. This seemed like a minor technical adjustment at the time, removing a coin that nobody was using anyway. But the timing would prove fateful, and the decision would later be denounced as the crime of 1873 by those who felt betrayed. The reason the timing mattered was that just as silver was being demonetized, vast new deposits of silver were being discovered in the American West. The Comstock lode in Nevada, discovered in 1859, had already proven to be one of the richest silver strikes in history, producing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of the metal. Other major discoveries followed in Colorado, Idaho, Montana, and other western territories. Silver poured out of the mountains in quantities that transformed the market, driving down the price relative to gold. Suddenly, silver miners and the states they enriched wanted silver to be coined freely, as it had been before 1873. At the old ratio of 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold, they could bring their silver to the mint and receive good value. But with silver demonetized, they had to sell it on the open market at declining prices. Western interests joined forces with indebted farmers who saw silver coinage as a way to expand the currency supply and ease the burden of debt. The free silver movement was born. The argument was framed in terms that echoed with moral conviction. Silver advocates spoke of the rights of the people against the interests of Eastern bankers and British financiers. They portrayed the gold standard as a conspiracy to enrich creditors at the expense of producers, to concentrate wealth in the hands of the few while the many struggled. Free silver meant abundant money, opportunity for the common person, escape from the stranglehold of deflation. Gold, in this narrative, was the metal of oppression, silver the metal of liberation. Gold advocates responded with their own moral language. Sound money meant honest money, they argued, currency that maintained its value, that could not be manipulated by politicians printing paper or coining cheap silver. The gold standard represented stability, creditworthiness, membership in the community of civilized nations. To abandon gold for silver would be to invite inflation, to cheat creditors, to destroy the nation's financial reputation. Gold, in their narrative, was the foundation of prosperity, while silver represented populist delusion. Congress responded to the silver pressure with compromise legislation. The Bland-Allison Act of 1878 required the Treasury to purchase between $2 million and $4 million worth of silver each month, and coin it into silver dollars. This was less than the free silver advocates wanted, far more than the gold standard supporters desired. The silver dollars that resulted, large heavy coins bearing the image of liberty and an eagle, circulated reluctantly. People preferred paper currency or gold, and the silver dollars piled up in treasury vaults, coined but unused. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 went further, requiring the Treasury to purchase 4.5 million ounces of silver each month, nearly the entire domestic production. In exchange for the silver, the Treasury issued notes that were redeemable in either gold or silver at the government's discretion. This was an attempt to satisfy silver interests without abandoning the gold standard, but it created an unstable situation. Holders of the Treasury notes naturally wanted gold, since gold was worth more. The government's gold reserves began to drain away as people exchanged silver certificates for gold coins. By 1893, the strains in the system triggered a severe financial panic. The Reading Railroad went bankrupt in February, followed by other major companies. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment rose. The panic was partly a result of overconstruction and speculation, but the monetary uncertainty contributed to the crisis. Foreign investors, worried about America's commitment to gold, withdrew their capital. The Treasury's gold reserve, which had stood at $190 million at the beginning of 1893, fell toward the psychological threshold of $100 million, the minimum that financial markets considered adequate. President Grover Cleveland, a gold standard Democrat who had returned to office for a second term in 1893, believed that the Sherman Silver Purchase Act was undermining confidence in the dollar. He called Congress into special session and demanded repeal of the silver purchase requirement. After bitter debate, Congress complied in October of 1893. The silver purchases stopped, but the damage to the economy was not immediately reversed. The gold reserve continued to drain, falling below $100 million in early 1894. Cleveland found himself in the humiliating position of having to turn to private bankers for help. In February of 1895, a syndicate led by J.P. Morgan agreed to provide $65 million in gold to the Treasury in exchange for government bonds. Morgan was the most powerful banker in America, a man whose personal credit was sometimes considered better than the government's. His intervention stabilized the situation, but it also reinforced the populist narrative that the government was in thrall to Wall Street. The election of 1896 became a referendum on the gold standard and the soul of American democracy. The Democratic Party, traditionally the party of limited government and sound money, was captured by the silver forces. At the party's convention in Chicago, a young former congressman from Nebraska named William Jennings Bryan delivered a speech that would become one of the most famous in American political history. Bryan was 36 years old, handsome and eloquent, with a gift for oratory that could move crowds to tears. He spoke for the farmers and workers, for the debtors and the struggling, for all those who felt that the gold standard was crushing them under its weight. His speech built to a crescendo with words that rang through the convention hall and echoed across the nation. "You shall not press down upon the brow of labour this crown of thorns," he declared, his voice rising with passion. "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The delegates erupted in wild applause. Bryan won the nomination on the strength of that speech, becoming the youngest major party presidential candidate in American history at that point. The Free Silver forces had their champion, a man who could articulate their grievances and their hopes with biblical fervour. The Republican candidate was William McKinley, the governor of Ohio, a man who supported the gold standard with quiet determination. McKinley's campaign was managed by Mark Hanna, a Cleveland industrialist who raised unprecedented amounts of money from businesses that feared what a Bryan victory might mean. The campaign of 1896 was intense, with Bryan travelling the country by rail, giving speech after speech, sometimes dozens in a single day, while McKinley conducted a front porch campaign from his home in Canton, Ohio, receiving delegations who came to hear his views. McKinley won, though not overwhelmingly, carrying the industrial states and the Northeast, while Bryan swept the South and much of the West. The election was as much about region and economic interest as about abstract monetary policy. Urban workers, despite Bryan's appeals, tended to support McKinley, perhaps fearing that inflation would erode their wages faster than it would reduce their debts. The gold standard had survived its greatest challenge. The debate had not been settled by reasoned economic analysis, but by political coalition and electoral calculation. Yet even as the votes were counted, events were changing the underlying reality. Gold discoveries in South Africa, Alaska, and Australia were increasing the world supply of the metal, making the currency expansion that silver advocates had sought through silver coinage unnecessary. New refining techniques allowed gold to be extracted more efficiently from low-grade ore. The money supply could grow on a gold standard, after all, if enough gold could be found. In March of 1900, Congress passed the Gold Standard Act, formally defining the dollar as 25 8/10 grains of gold 9/10 fine, which worked out to about $20.67 per ounce of pure gold. This was the ratio that had existed since 1834, now codified in law with silver officially subordinated to a supporting role. The gold dollar was declared the standard unit of value, and all forms of money were to be maintained at parity with gold. The question that had divided the nation for a quarter century was settled. The United States was on the gold standard, fully and officially. The gold standard brought with it a certain rigidity, a discipline that constrained what governments could do. You could not print money at will, because the currency had to be backed by gold reserves. This meant that the money supply grew only as fast as the gold supply, which in turn meant that prices tended to remain stable or even decline gradually over time. For creditors and savers, for those who valued stability and predictability, this was ideal. For debtors and entrepreneurs, for those who needed credit to grow, it could feel restrictive, like trying to expand an economy through a narrow tunnel. But the discipline also brought benefits that were harder to see, advantages that revealed themselves only over time. A stable currency facilitated international trade, making it easier to calculate profit and loss across borders. It encouraged foreign investment, as investors knew their capital would not be eroded by inflation. It made long-term planning more feasible, since prices and wages could be expected to remain relatively predictable. The gold standard was not perfect, but it provided a framework that the growing American economy could work within, and the economy was growing remarkably. The late 19th century saw the United States transform from an agricultural nation into an industrial power. Steel production soared, railroads spanned the continent, factories in the Northeast and Midwest turned out goods in quantities that had been unimaginable a generation earlier. Oil fields in Pennsylvania and later in Texas provided fuel for a new economy built on petroleum. The population swelled with immigration from Europe and Asia, providing labor for the expanding industries. The dollar, anchored to gold, became increasingly respected in international markets. Foreign merchants began to accept payment in dollars more readily, recognizing that the American currency was sound, that it would hold its value, that the United States was becoming an economic power that had to be taken seriously. The dollar was not yet the dominant international currency. That position still belonged to the British pound sterling, backed by the vast wealth and commercial reach of the British Empire. But the dollar was rising, growing in importance as America's economy grew, establishing the foundation for the even greater role it would play in the century to come. The battles over currency, bitter as they had been, had forged a stronger monetary system. The chaotic diversity of the free banking era was gone, replaced by a more uniform currency. The question of gold versus silver had been resolved in gold's favour, providing the stability that financial markets valued. The greenbacks, once controversial, had become an accepted part of the currency mix, supplementing gold coins without undermining confidence in the dollar's value. The national banking system, for all its limitations, provided a network of federally supervised institutions that brought some order to American finance. The dollar of 1900 was still primarily a domestic currency, used within the United States but not widely held abroad. It was still defined in terms of gold, a tangible anchor that limited what the government could do, but also constrained what could go wrong. It was in many ways a 19th century currency, suited to an economy that was still largely agricultural despite its growing industrial capacity. The transformations that would make the dollar the world's currency, the changes that would fundamentally alter its nature, still lay ahead, waiting in the new century that was just beginning. The early years of the 20th century brought remarkable prosperity to the United States. but also a growing awareness that the financial system, for all its improvements, remained fragile. The economy expanded rapidly, driven by new technologies and industries. Automobiles began to appear on city streets, electric lighting replaced gas lamps, and factories hummed with productive energy. But this growth came in fits and starts, periodically interrupted by financial panics that seemed to strike without warning, freezing credit and toppling banks. The national banking system, created during the Civil War, had brought order to the currency, but it had not solved the fundamental problem of financial instability. Banks still failed with troubling regularity. Credit markets still seized up when confidence wavered, and there was no central institution that could provide emergency liquidity. No lender of last resort that could inject money into the system when panic threatened to become catastrophe. The country had grown far larger and more complex than the framers of the National Banking Acts had anticipated, and the system they created was showing its age. The Panic of 1907 revealed these weaknesses with particular clarity. It began, as panics often do, with a speculation gone wrong. Two stockbrokers attempted to corner the market in shares of the United Copper Company, betting that they could drive up the price by controlling the supply. The scheme collapsed when they discovered that more shares existed than they had anticipated. The broker's firm failed, and the banks associated with it came under pressure as depositors rushed to withdraw their funds. The panic spread from these initial failures like ripples across still water. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of New York's largest financial institutions, found itself facing a run. Depositors lined up outside its doors, waiting hours in the autumn cold to withdraw their savings. The trust company's reserves, which had seemed adequate in normal times, proved insufficient when everyone wanted their money at once. Knickerbocker closed on October 22nd after paying out $8 million to anxious customers. Other trust companies and banks faced similar runs. The New York Stock Exchange saw share prices plummet as investors sold in panic. Credit disappeared as banks hoarded their reserves, unwilling to lend when they might need every dollar to satisfy their own depositors. The machinery of finance, so smooth and efficient in good times, ground nearly to a halt. Into this crisis stepped a single man, not a government official but a private banker, who organized a rescue through force of personality and the weight of his reputation. John Pierpont Morgan was 70 years old in 1907, white-haired and imposing, with piercing eyes and a nose disfigured by a skin condition. He was the most powerful financier in America, perhaps in the world, and he commanded respect that bordered on fear. When Morgan spoke, other bankers listened. Morgan convened meetings in his library on Madison Avenue, bringing together the leading bankers of New York to coordinate their response. He assessed which institutions were fundamentally sound and which were beyond saving. He organized pools of money to support the salvageable banks, letting the hopeless ones fail. He persuaded the Secretary of the Treasury to deposit federal funds in New York banks, adding liquidity to the system. He even convinced a group of clergymen to preach calm from their pulpits on Sunday, urging their congregations not to panic. The crisis subsided after about 3 weeks, order gradually returning to the financial markets. Morgan's intervention had worked, but the episode left a troubling question hanging in the air. Was it really appropriate for the stability of the American financial system to depend on the judgment and resources of a single private banker, however capable? What would happen when Morgan was no longer available, when the next crisis came and no individual commanded sufficient authority and wealth to organize a rescue, these questions prompted a serious examination of American banking and monetary policy. In 1908, Congress established the National Monetary Commission, chaired by Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, to study the banking systems of the United States and Europe and recommend reforms. Aldrich was a powerful Republican, a successful businessman before entering politics, and he approached the task with thoroughness. The commission spent 2 years studying how other nations managed their currencies and banking systems, travelling to Europe to observe the central banks that governed finance there. What Aldrich and his colleagues discovered was that the United States was unusual among major economies in lacking a central bank. Britain had the Bank of England, France the Bank of France, Germany the Reichsbank. These institutions could expand or contract credit as economic conditions required, serving as lenders of last resort during panics, coordinating the banking system to maintain stability. The United States had nothing comparable, no institution that could perform these functions systematically rather than depending on ad hoc interventions by private bankers. In November of 1910, Senator Aldrich convened a secret meeting to draft a proposal for reforming American banking. The meeting took place on Jekyll Island, a resort off the coast of Georgia, and was attended by a small group of financial experts and bankers. The secrecy was deliberate. Banking reform was politically controversial, and Aldrich knew that if the plan appeared to come from Wall Street bankers, it would face fierce opposition from those who distrusted concentrated financial power. Better to work quietly and present a finished proposal that could be defended on its merits. The men who gathered on Jekyll Island included Paul Warburg, a German-born banker who had studied European central banking extensively and understood the technical details of how such institutions operated. There was Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, one of New York's largest institutions. Benjamin Strong, a partner at J.P. Morgan's firm, brought practical experience from the front lines of American banking. Together, over the course of a week, they sketched out a plan for a central banking system adapted to American conditions and prejudices. The plan they developed was a compromise between competing visions. Rather than a single central bank headquartered in New York, which would have concentrated power in a way that Western and Southern states would never accept, the proposal called for a system of regional reserve banks, perhaps 12 of them, distributed across the country. Each regional bank would serve the banks and businesses in its territory, providing local knowledge and responsiveness. These regional banks would be coordinated by a central board in Washington, ensuring some unity of policy while dispersing power geographically. The proposal that emerged from Jekyll Island became the foundation for legislation that Senator Aldrich introduced, though it would take several years and considerable modification before it could pass Congress. The political challenge was substantial. William Jennings Bryan and his progressive allies distrusted any proposal that seemed to benefit Wall Street. Conservative Republicans worried about creating a powerful new government institution. Finding a path that could satisfy both groups required patience and skill. The breakthrough came after the election of 1912, which brought Woodrow Wilson to the presidency and gave Democrats control of Congress. Wilson was sympathetic to banking reform, understanding that the economy needed a more elastic currency, one that could expand and contract with the needs of commerce rather than being rigidly fixed by gold reserves. Congressman Carter Glass of Virginia, chairman of the House Banking Committee, worked with Wilson to craft legislation that could win support from both conservative bankers and progressive reformers. The Federal Reserve Act that Congress passed in December of 1913 incorporated elements from multiple sources. It created not one central bank, but a system of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, located in cities from Boston to San Francisco. These regional banks would be owned by the member banks in their districts, giving private bankers a stake in the system. But the regional banks would be overseen by a Federal Reserve Board in Washington, appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, ensuring public accountability. It was a hybrid structure, neither purely private nor purely governmental, designed to balance competing interests and concerns. The Federal Reserve was granted several important powers. It could issue a new form of currency, Federal Reserve notes, which would gradually replace the various other forms of paper money then in circulation. These notes would be backed by gold and commercial paper, providing security while allowing the money supply to expand when businesses needed credit. The Federal Reserve could also set the discount rate, the interest rate at which it would lend to member banks, giving it a tool to influence the cost and availability of credit throughout the economy. And it could buy and sell government securities, though this power would not be fully appreciated or utilized until later years. President Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law on December 23, 1913. The date fell between Christmas and the year's end, a quiet time when Washington was preparing for holiday celebrations. But the significance of what had been accomplished was profound. After 3/4 of a century without a central bank, the United States had finally created an institution that could manage its currency and banking system systematically. The Federal Reserve represented a bet that expertise and careful management could smooth out the boom and bust cycles that had plagued American finance, that human judgment and institutional design could tame the wild swings of credit and panic. The Federal Reserve Banks opened for business in November of 1914, just months after the outbreak of war in Europe. That war, which would eventually be called the First World War, would provide the new institution with its first major test. The conflict disrupted international trade and finance, sent gold flowing between nations in unprecedented quantities, and eventually drew the United States into the fighting, requiring mobilization of resources on a scale the nation had never attempted. When war began in August of 1914, financial markets around the world convulsed. The New York Stock Exchange closed for several months, the longest closure in its history, as authorities tried to prevent panic selling. Gold flowed out of the United States toward Britain and France, nations that needed to purchase American goods and convert their dollar holdings into gold to settle accounts. The Federal Reserve, still organizing itself and learning its role, had to manage these strains while establishing its credibility. But as the war continued, year after terrible year, the flow of gold reversed. Britain and France borrowed heavily from American banks and the American government to finance their war efforts. They purchased enormous quantities of American food, munitions, and manufactured goods. American farms and factories spared the destruction that was consuming Europe, operated at capacity and beyond. The gold that European nations had accumulated over centuries began to cross the Atlantic, payment for the goods and credit that America provided. By 1917, when the United States entered the war as a combatant after Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, the country had transformed from a debtor nation into a creditor. European governments owed billions of dollars to American lenders. The United States held a larger share of the world's gold reserves than any other nation, and the dollar, which had been a secondary currency in international trade, began to rival the British pound sterling as a medium for global commerce. Financing American participation in the war required mobilizing resources on an unprecedented scale. The government borrowed through Liberty bonds, securities that citizens were urged to purchase as a patriotic duty. The bonds were sold in drives that swept across the country, promoted by celebrities and supported by massive advertising campaigns. Buying a Liberty bond was presented as a way to support the troops overseas, to help defeat the Kaiser, to demonstrate American commitment to the cause. Millions of Americans who had never invested in securities before purchased bonds, often in small denominations that fit modest budgets. The Federal Reserve supported this borrowing by keeping interest rates low and purchasing some bonds itself. This injected money into the economy, helping to finance government spending but also creating inflationary pressure. Prices rose as the government competed with consumers for goods and services, as workers' wages increased to match the demand for labour. By the time the war ended in November of 1918, prices had roughly doubled from their pre-war levels. The end of the war brought new challenges. The federal government had to transition from wartime spending to peacetime budgets. The military had to demobilize millions of soldiers, and the economy had to convert from producing weapons to producing consumer goods. The Federal Reserve, concerned about inflation, raised interest rates sharply in 1919 and 1920, attempting to cool an overheating economy. The medicine worked, but perhaps too well. The economy contracted into a severe recession in 1920 and 1921, with unemployment rising and prices falling sharply. This recession was brief but painful, testing the Federal Reserve's judgment and revealing the limits of its power. The institution was still learning how to use its tools, still discovering how changes in interest rates or the money supply rippled through a complex economy. But the recession ended naturally, without the prolonged agony of some earlier downturns, and the economy recovered into the prosperous decade of the 1920s. The dollar emerged from the war years in a fundamentally different position than it had occupied before. Where once it had been primarily a domestic currency, used within the United States but rarely held by foreigners, it now circulated internationally. European companies held dollars to settle transactions. European banks kept dollar deposits. European governments included dollars in their reserves, alongside gold and pounds sterling. The Federal Reserve banks maintained relationships with foreign central banks, coordinating gold flows and currency stabilization efforts. New York was becoming a rival to London as a center of international finance. The Federal Reserve notes that the new system issued had become the dominant form of American currency. The old national bank notes gradually disappeared from circulation, redeemed and retired as banks converted to the Federal Reserve System. Greenbacks, those Civil War relics, continued to exist but represented an ever smaller fraction of the currency supply. The coins remained, gold and silver and copper still in circulation, still legally defined as money, but increasingly supplemented by paper that was more convenient to carry and easier to use for large transactions. Imagine holding a Federal Reserve note from 1920, one of those early bills that replaced the diverse currencies of previous decades. It would look somewhat different from a modern dollar bill, the design not yet standardized into the familiar portrait and monument format. The note would be larger, about 1/3 bigger than today's currency, and the artwork would be more ornate, with elaborate borders and detailed engravings. But it would bear the same essential promise, the declaration that this piece of paper was legal tender for all debts, public and private, that it represented $1 of value backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. The creation of the Federal Reserve marked a turning point in the story of the dollar, a moment when the currency gained an institutional shepherd, an organization dedicated to managing its value and defending its stability. The system was not perfect. It would make mistakes, some quite serious, in the decades ahead. But it represented a recognition that modern economies required active management, that the gold standard alone could not provide the flexibility that commerce and industry needed, that human institutions could and should attempt to smooth the rough edges of economic life. The dollar of 1920 was still tied to gold, still defined as 25 and 8/10 grains of 9/10 fine gold, still theoretically exchangeable for the precious metal on demand. But it was also managed by the Federal Reserve, subject to policies that could expand or contract its supply, that could make credit easier or tighter depending on economic conditions. It was a hybrid currency, one foot in the 19th century world of metallic money, the other stepping toward the 20th century reality of managed fiat currency. The full transition to fiat money still lay decades ahead, waiting for circumstances that would force a final break with gold. But the groundwork was being laid, the institutions created, the experience accumulated that would make that transition possible when the time came. The 1920s began with a sharp recession, but quickly transformed into a decade of remarkable prosperity and optimism. The economy grew steadily, industrial production increased, and new technologies changed daily life in ways both large and small. Radios brought entertainment and news into homes across the country. Automobiles, once luxury items for the wealthy, became affordable for middle-class families as Henry Ford's assembly lines drove prices down. Electric appliances made household work less burdensome. Cities grew upward, skyscrapers rising to heights that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. The stock market became a national obsession during these years. Share prices climbed month after month, year after year, creating wealth on paper that seemed almost magical. Ordinary people who had never considered investing before opened brokerage accounts, buying shares on margin, paying only a fraction of the purchase price and borrowing the rest. The loan seemed safe because everyone knew that stock prices would continue rising, that the economy had entered a new era where the old rules no longer applied. Prosperity had become not just a reality but an expectation, almost an entitlement. The Federal Reserve, still learning its role in this managed monetary system, kept interest rates relatively low through much of the decade. Credit was easy, money flowed freely, and optimism fed upon itself. Some observers worried that speculation had gone too far, that share prices had lost touch with the underlying value of the companies they represented. But these warnings were drowned out by the chorus of voices insisting that America had achieved a permanent prosperity, that the boom would continue indefinitely. The peak came in September of 1929. The stock market had reached levels that seemed to justify every optimistic prediction, every ambitious dream. But in October, something shifted. Prices began to fall gently at first, then with gathering momentum. On October 24th, a Thursday that would be remembered as Black Thursday. Panic selling overwhelmed the exchanges. Prices plummeted as investors rushed to sell, unable to find buyers except at steep discounts. The following Tuesday, October 29th, was worse. The market collapsed in an avalanche of selling, with share prices falling so rapidly that the ticker tape machines could not keep up, their printed reports running hours behind the actual trading. Fortunes that had been built over years vanished in hours. Investors who had bought on margin found themselves owing far more than their shares were now worth. Their loans suddenly unpayable, their savings wiped out. The crash did not immediately destroy the economy. Stock market losses, however dramatic, affected primarily those who owned shares, a minority of Americans. But the crash shattered confidence, and it revealed weaknesses in the financial system that had been hidden during the good times. Banks that had lent money for stock purchases faced borrowers who could not repay. Businesses that had expanded on credit found consumers reluctant to spend. The optimism that had driven the boom reversed into caution, even fear, and that shift in sentiment began to affect the real economy of production and employment. Through 1930 and 1931, the situation deteriorated steadily. Businesses closed, laying off workers who then had less money to spend, causing more businesses to struggle. Farmers, already facing low prices for their crops, saw conditions worsen as urban demand declined. Banks came under increasing pressure as borrowers defaulted on loans and depositors, worried about the safety of their savings, withdrew cash. The banks in turn called in loans and refused new credit, tightening the squeeze on businesses and individuals alike. Bank failures became epidemic. In 1930, more than 1,300 banks closed their doors, unable to satisfy depositors' demands. In 1931, another 2,400 failed. These were not just numbers in a ledger. Each failure meant families losing their life savings, businesses unable to meet payroll, communities losing the institutions that had facilitated commerce and provided credit for generations. The wave of failures fed upon itself as each closure increased anxiety about other banks, prompting more withdrawals, more strain, more failures. The Federal Reserve, which had been created precisely to prevent such cascading collapses, proved unequal to the challenge. The institution was still governed by a philosophy that valued sound money and feared inflation above all else. When banks failed, the Federal Reserve often stood aside, reasoning that weak institutions should be allowed to disappear, that the system would be stronger for their elimination. This was not cruelty, but a sincere belief in economic principles that taught that depressions were necessary purgings, painful but ultimately healthy adjustments. That these principles might be wrong or at least incomplete was not yet widely recognized. By 1933, the banking system was approaching complete breakdown. Over 9,000 banks had failed during the preceding 3 years, destroying more than $2 billion in deposits. Those banks that remained open were so frightened of runs that they hoarded their reserves, refusing to lend even to credit-worthy borrowers. People who had lost faith in banks stuffed currency into mattresses or buried gold coins in their yards, removing money from circulation just when the economy needed it most. The velocity of money, the speed at which dollars changed hands, slowed dramatically as fear paralyzed economic activity. Into this crisis stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt, inaugurated as president on March 4, 1933. Roosevelt came to office with a mandate for change and a willingness to experiment. His inaugural address famously declared that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, an attempt to rally national spirits. But words alone could not repair the shattered banking system. Action was needed, and Roosevelt acted with remarkable speed. On March 6th, 2 days after taking office, Roosevelt declared a bank holiday, closing every bank in the nation for 4 days. This was an extraordinary exercise of executive power, stopping commerce midstream, but it was also necessary to prevent the final collapse of the system. During the holiday, Treasury officials and banking examiners assessed which banks were sound enough to reopen and which should remain closed permanently. The Emergency Banking Act, passed by Congress in a single day on March 9th, gave the government authority to reorganize failed banks and provide support to those that could be saved. When banks began reopening on March 13th, Roosevelt went on the radio to explain what had been done and why. These radio addresses, which would become known as fireside chats, were intimate and conversational, the president speaking directly to citizens in their living rooms. Roosevelt's first fireside chat about banking was a masterpiece of reassurance, explaining complex financial matters in simple terms, asking for trust, promising that reopened banks were safe. The gamble worked. When banks opened their doors, people deposited money rather than withdrawing it. The immediate crisis was resolved. But Roosevelt's monetary policies were just beginning. In April of 1933, he took a step that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Executive Order 6102 required American citizens to surrender their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve, receiving paper currency in exchange at the rate of $20.67 per ounce. There were limited exceptions for jewelry, rare coins, and small holdings, but the essential effect was to confiscate gold from private hands, concentrating it in government vaults. The rationale for gold confiscation was both practical and ideological. Practically, the government wanted to prevent hoarding, to ensure that gold flowed into the treasury, where it could back currency and support government policy. Ideologically, Roosevelt and his advisers believed that the gold standard has become a constraint on economic recovery, limiting the government's ability to expand the money supply and stimulate activity. By taking gold out of private hands and then revaluing it, the government could create the monetary expansion that the economy needed. The Gold Reserve Act of January 1934 went further, formally devaluing the dollar from $20.67 per ounce of gold to $35 per ounce. This represented a reduction of about 40% in the dollar's gold content, a dramatic change in the monetary standard that had been stable since 1834. The devaluation had several effects. It made American exports cheaper for foreign buyers, helping struggling manufacturers and farmers. It increased the dollar value of the Treasury's gold reserves, creating paper profits that could support government spending, and it signaled that the government was willing to use monetary policy aggressively to fight the Depression. But the devaluation also meant that Americans could no longer exchange their dollars for gold at will. Citizens were prohibited from owning monetary gold. Only foreign governments and central banks could redeem dollars for gold, and then only for international settlements. The gold standard, as it had existed for ordinary Americans, was effectively ended. The dollar remained defined in terms of gold for international purposes, but domestically it had become a managed currency, its value determined by government policy rather than by a fixed relationship to precious metal. The Silver Purchase Act of 1934 represented a political compromise with Western mining interests, who had been demanding attention to silver since the free silver campaigns of the 1890s. The Act required the Treasury to purchase silver until either silver represented 1/4 of the monetary reserves, or the market price of silver reached its official monetary value. This pleased silver-producing states and pumped some money into Western economies, though the practical effect on the Depression was modest. Silver certificates, notes backed by silver in the Treasury, entered circulation alongside Federal Reserve notes and the remaining greenbacks. The New Deal brought many changes beyond monetary policy. Bank deposits were insured by the new Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, guaranteeing that people would not lose their savings even if their bank failed. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created to regulate stock markets and prevent the abuses that had contributed to the speculation of the 20s. Social Security promised support for the elderly and unemployed. These institutions reshaped American economic life, creating a safety net that had not existed before and expanding the role of government in ways that would have shocked earlier generations. The economy recovered slowly through the middle and late 1930s, never quite reaching the prosperity of the 20s, but gradually improving from the depths of 1933. Unemployment remained distressingly high, factories operated below capacity, and the lingering effects of the Depression cast a shadow over daily life. But conditions were better than they had been, banks were stable, and hope was being restored. The Federal Reserve learned from its failures, becoming more willing to inject liquidity during times of stress, more aware that its inaction could worsen rather than cure economic ailments. Then, in September of 1939, war returned to Europe. Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany, beginning a conflict that would eventually consume much of the world. The United States initially remained neutral, but American factories began producing weapons and supplies for Britain and other nations resisting German expansion. The economy, which had struggled throughout the Depression, suddenly found demand for everything it could produce. By December of 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States entered the war as a combatant, the American economy was already mobilizing for total war. The transition was remarkable in its speed and scale. Factories that had built automobiles now built tanks and aircraft. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in manufacturing and other industries traditionally reserved for men. The government borrowed on an enormous scale, issuing war bonds that citizens purchased both from patriotism and from the lack of consumer goods to spend their wages on. The Federal Reserve supported the war effort by keeping interest rates low and purchasing government bonds, ensuring that the Treasury could borrow whatever was needed at affordable rates. This was easier monetary policy than the Fed would have chosen in peacetime, and it created inflationary pressure that was controlled through wage and price controls, rationing, and appeals to patriotic sacrifice. But it allowed the government to mobilize resources without the financial constraints that had limited previous wars. The dollar flowed outward during the war years, payment for American goods purchased by allied nations, compensation for the troops stationed overseas, support for governments struggling to survive. By the end of the war, the United States would hold the majority of the world's monetary gold, accumulated through years of trade surpluses and foreign borrowing. American factories had escaped the bombing that devastated Europe and Japan, leaving the United States with productive capacity far exceeding that of any other nation. The question of how the post-war world would organize its monetary affairs, how currencies would relate to each other and to gold, was becoming urgent as victory approached. In July of 1944, while the war still raged in Europe and the Pacific, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The location was chosen partly for its beauty and isolation, a resort in the White Mountains where diplomats could work without distraction. The conference lasted 3 weeks, negotiating agreements that would shape international finance for a generation. The Bretton Woods Conference faced the question of how to avoid the monetary chaos that had plagued the interwar years. In the 1920s and 30s, currencies had fluctuated wildly, countries had engaged in competitive devaluations, and the lack of coordination had contributed to the Depression's severity. The delegates wanted a system that would provide stability without the rigidity of the classical gold standard, flexibility without the chaos of freely floating currencies. The American proposal, drafted largely by Harry Dexter White of the Treasury Department, called for a system centered on the dollar. The United States would maintain the dollar's convertibility to gold at $35 per ounce, the rate established in 1934. Other nations would peg their currencies to the dollar at fixed exchange rates, maintaining those pegs through intervention in currency markets. The system would be supervised by a new international monetary fund, which could provide loans to countries facing temporary balance of payments difficulties, allowing them to maintain their exchange rate pegs without immediately resorting to devaluation or deflation. The British, represented by the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, proposed an alternative that would have created an international currency called Bancor, used for settlements between central banks. This would have distributed power more evenly, avoiding dependence on any single nation's currency. But the American proposal prevailed, partly because the United States held most of the world's gold and provided the economic strength that made any monetary system viable. The Bretton Woods Agreement, as it was finalized, made the dollar the center of the international monetary system, the currency to which all others were tied, the link between gold and the world economy. The conference also created the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank, to provide long-term loans for rebuilding war-damaged economies. Together, the IMF and World Bank would form the institutional architecture of the post-war monetary system, multilateral organizations that reflected American power but also constrained it, embedding the United States in a web of international cooperation and obligation. When the war ended in August of 1945, the United States stood in a position of unparalleled economic dominance. Its cities were intact, its factories humming with productive potential, its people employed and relatively prosperous. The rest of the industrial world lay in ruins, Germany and Japan devastated by bombing and invasion, Britain and France exhausted by years of war. The Soviet Union had suffered catastrophic losses, 20 million dead and much of its western territory destroyed. Only the United States emerged from the war stronger than it had entered. The dollar, which had been a rising international currency before the war, now stood at the center of the global economy. It was the currency that war-torn nations needed to purchase the goods and machinery that would rebuild their economies. It was the currency in which international transactions were increasingly denominated. It was the currency that other central banks held in their reserves, trusting that the United States would maintain its value and honor its promise to convert dollars to gold at $35 per ounce. The journey from those chaotic colonial days, when Spanish dollars and tobacco notes circulated alongside wampum and British pounds, had led to this moment. The dollar had evolved from a unit of account adopted for its familiarity into the linchpin of global finance. It had survived the inflation of the continental currency, the chaos of the free banking era, the bitter debates over silver and gold, the creation of the Federal Reserve, the depression that had seemed to threaten everything. And now it stood not just as American money, but as the world's money, the medium through which international commerce flowed, the store of value that nations trusted with their reserves. The Bretton Woods system was born from the ashes of war, from the determination to build a more stable and prosperous world than the one that had collapsed into depression and conflict. The dollar's role in that system was both a privilege and a responsibility, granting the United States enormous advantages, but also requiring it to manage its currency with an eye toward global needs, not just domestic concerns. How America would handle that responsibility, whether the system would endure or eventually fracture under its internal tensions, remained to be seen as the world entered the post-war era. The world that emerged from the devastation of the Second World War needed to be rebuilt, physically and financially. Cities lay in rubble, factories stood silent, bridges and railways had been destroyed, and millions of people faced hunger and homelessness. The task was immense, perhaps the greatest reconstruction effort in human history, and at the centre of that effort, providing the resources and the mechanism for recovery, stood the American dollar. The Bretton Woods system, negotiated while bombs still fell, now had to be implemented in the practical reality of peacetime. The agreement called for currencies to be pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates, with the dollar itself convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. This meant that foreign central banks could exchange their dollar holdings for gold at that price, while the United States promised to maintain sufficient reserves to honor such requests. It was a hybrid arrangement, not quite a pure gold standard, since only official institutions could demand gold, but not quite fiat money either, since the gold link remained for international settlements. The immediate post-war years revealed a curious problem. Europe and Japan needed dollars desperately to purchase American goods, to import the machinery and raw materials necessary for reconstruction. But they had few dollars and little means of earning them, since their own economies were shattered and they had little to export. This dollar shortage, as it came to be called, threatened to strangle recovery before it could properly begin. Without dollars, Europe could not buy what it needed. Without recovery, Europe could not produce goods to sell for dollars. The circle seemed unbreakable. The American response was the European Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan after Secretary of State George Marshall, who announced it in a commencement address at Harvard in June of 1947. The Marshall Plan provided grants and loans to European nations, dollars that they could use to purchase American goods or to stabilize their currencies. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States would provide roughly $13 billion in aid, an enormous sum representing perhaps $150 billion in today's purchasing power. The Marshall Plan was partly humanitarian, a generous gesture toward nations that had been allies and even toward former enemies like Germany and Italy. but it was also self-interested, a recognition that American prosperity depended on having trading partners wealthy enough to buy American goods, and that political stability in Europe required economic recovery. A prosperous, democratic Europe would be a better neighbour than a desperate, potentially radical one. The dollars flowed outward, and with them went the goods and expertise that allowed Europe to rebuild. Japan received similar assistance, though through different mechanisms, as American occupation authorities worked to revive the devastated Japanese economy. Here, too, dollars provided the foundation, the currency in which trade was conducted and reserves accumulated. The pattern was the same whether in Europe or Asia, dollars flowing outward from the United States, creating the liquidity that the post-war economy needed. This outward flow of dollars had a curious effect. Where the immediate post-war period had been characterized by dollar shortage, by the late 1950s the concern was shifting toward dollar surplus. The United States was spending dollars abroad for military bases, for foreign aid, for imports from recovering economies. American tourists traveled to Europe, spending dollars on hotels and restaurants and souvenirs. American corporations invested overseas, building factories and establishing subsidiaries, paying for these investments in dollars. All of this meant that dollars accumulated in foreign hands, held by foreign banks and foreign central banks, claims on American gold that grew steadily larger. The Bretton Woods system depended on confidence that the United States would maintain the dollar's gold convertibility. As long as foreign governments believed they could exchange their dollars for gold at $35 per ounce, they were willing to hold dollars as reserves. Dollars were more convenient than gold, earning interest when deposited in banks, easily transferred for international transactions. But this convenience depended entirely on the credibility of the American promise. If that promise seemed doubtful, if foreign governments began to fear that the United States might not honour its commitment, the entire system could unravel rapidly. In 1960, an economist named Robert Triffin identified a fundamental paradox in the Bretton Woods system, a contradiction that would come to bear his name. The Triffin dilemma, as it was called, pointed out that the system required the United States to run balance of payments deficits, to send more dollars abroad than it received back, in order to supply the world with the dollars it needed for reserves and transactions. But these persistent deficits meant that foreign dollar holdings would eventually exceed American gold reserves, undermining confidence in convertibility. The system contained the seeds of its own destruction, requiring the very behaviour that would ultimately make it unsustainable. Triffin's warning was prescient, though it would take another decade for the full implications to become clear. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the system functioned reasonably well. Exchange rates remained stable, facilitating international trade and investment. The major currencies were convertible, meaning they could be freely exchanged for one another at the fixed rates. Capital flowed across borders with relative ease, seeking the highest returns, financing development and growth. The post-war economic boom, which saw living standards rise dramatically in the developed world, owed much to this monetary stability. For Americans, these were years of remarkable prosperity. The economy grew steadily, suburbs sprawled outward from city centres, and a broad middle class enjoyed comforts that previous generations could hardly have imagined. Homes filled with appliances, driveways held automobiles, television brought entertainment and news into every living room. The dollar in an American's pocket bought a great deal, prices stable and wages rising. It was easy to take for granted this prosperity, to assume it would continue indefinitely, to see the dollar's strength as a permanent feature of the landscape. But maintaining the Bretton Woods system required discipline, a willingness to subordinate domestic policy goals to the needs of international monetary stability. The United States had to manage its economy in ways that inspired confidence abroad, keeping inflation low, maintaining the gold reserve, avoiding the temptation to use monetary policy too aggressively to address domestic concerns. This was the price of the dollar's privileged position, and for a time, American policymakers paid it willingly. The position of the dollar as the world's reserve currency brought advantages that some described with a mixture of envy and resentment as exorbitant privilege. The United States could run deficits and finance them by issuing dollars that foreigners were willing to hold. An American traveling to Paris could pay in dollars, confident they would be accepted. An American company buying a factory in Germany could make the purchase in its own currency. Other nations had to earn dollars or other foreign currencies to conduct international business. The United States could simply issue them. The dollar's dominance was reflected in practical ways that shaped daily commerce around the world. Oil was priced in dollars, meaning that every nation needed dollars to purchase this essential commodity. Many international contracts were written in dollars, regardless of where the parties were located. Central banks held dollars alongside gold in their reserves, and sometimes preferred dollars for their convenience. The phrase, "the dollar is our currency, but your problem," captured this asymmetry, the way that American monetary policy decisions affected the entire world, while foreign policy had limited influence on American choices. In 1958, the major European currencies became convertible for current account transactions, meaning they could be freely exchanged at the fixed rates for trade purposes. This was an important milestone, a sign that the post-war recovery had reached the point where normal commerce could resume, but it also created a market where dollars accumulated outside the United States, held in European banks, lent and borrowed in what came to be called the euro-dollar market. These offshore dollars were beyond the direct control of American monetary authorities, a growing pool of liquidity that would complicate the management of the system. As the 1960s progressed, pressures on the dollar began to accumulate. The American economy remained strong, but inflation was creeping upward, partly from the costs of domestic programs and partly from spending on the war in Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society initiatives, ambitious programs to combat poverty and expand educational and healthcare access, required substantial government spending. The war in Vietnam, expanding from a limited commitment to a major military operation, cost billions of dollars annually. The combination strained the federal budget and pumped more dollars into an economy already operating near full capacity. Inflation in the United States meant that the dollar was buying less domestically, while the official gold price remained fixed at $35 per ounce. This created an incentive for foreign governments to convert their dollars to gold, exchanging depreciating paper for stable metal. The American gold reserve, which had stood at more than $20 billion at the end of the war, began to decline as foreign central banks exercised their right to redemption. By the middle 1960s, the gold reserve had fallen to roughly $13 billion, while foreign dollar holdings had grown far larger. The Johnson administration tried various measures to stem the gold outflow. It asked American corporations to limit foreign investment, requested that banks restrict loans to foreigners, and appealed to foreign governments to hold dollars rather than converting them to gold. These measures bought time but did not address the fundamental imbalance. The United States was spending more abroad than it was earning, and the difference was being made up by creating dollars that added to foreign holdings. The Triffin dilemma was unfolding exactly as predicted. In 1961, central banks from several major nations had established a gold pool, agreeing to coordinate their gold sales on the London market to keep the free market price close to the official price of $35 per ounce. The pool worked for several years, smoothing out fluctuations and maintaining the appearance of stability. But as pressure mounted, as more and more buyers sought gold anticipating that the official price might rise, the pool members found themselves selling ever larger quantities of gold to maintain the price. By March of 1968, the pool was collapsing under the weight of demand. The solution was to create a two-tier gold market. The official price of $35 per ounce would be maintained for transactions between central banks, but the free market price would be allowed to float, determined by supply and demand. This meant that private buyers and sellers might trade gold at prices far above $35 per ounce, while official institutions continued to use the Bretton Woods price. It was a compromise, an attempt to maintain the system's formal structure, while acknowledging that market forces were pulling in a different direction. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, became the most vocal critic of the dollar's privileged position. De Gaulle saw the Bretton Woods system as a form of American imperialism, allowing the United States to print money that others had to accept, financing American power through what amounted to an inflation tax on the rest of the world. He argued that the system gave the United States unfair advantages and called for a return to a true gold standard where no single currency held a privileged position. To emphasize his point, France began converting substantial dollar holdings to gold. Between 1965 and 1967, France exchanged roughly $191 million for gold, adding to the pressure on American reserves. De Gaulle's critique resonated with those who felt that American monetary policy was too loose, that the United States was exploiting its position to live beyond its means, but returning to a pure gold standard was not practical for a modern economy, and few nations were willing to endure the deflation and unemployment that such a transition might require. The criticism was sharp, but the alternatives were unclear. The International Monetary Fund, that institution created at Bretton Woods to oversee the system, attempted to address the liquidity problem by creating a new reserve asset called Special Drawing Rights, or SDRs. These were international money, created by the IMF and allocated to member nations based on their quotas in the organization. SDRs could be used to settle international obligations, supplementing gold and dollars as reserve assets. The first allocation came in 1970, providing roughly $9.5 billion worth of SDRs over 3 years. It was an attempt to reduce dependence on the dollar and relieve pressure on American gold reserves. But SDRs were a technical solution to what had become a political and economic problem. The fundamental issue was that the United States was running persistent deficits, that foreign dollar holdings were growing faster than American gold reserves, and that confidence in the system was eroding. By the late 1960s, the question was not whether the Bretton Woods system would change, but when and how. The dollar that a traveller might have exchanged at a bank in Paris or Tokyo or London in 1969 looked the same as it had a decade earlier. The paper was the same distinctive cotton-linen blend. The printing still featured those familiar portraits and symbols. The promise to pay the bearer on demand remained printed on every note. But the context had shifted. The certainty that dollars could always be converted to gold, the confidence that had undergirded the entire system, was beginning to fray. American policymakers faced an uncomfortable dilemma. To maintain the Bretton Woods system required restraining domestic spending, accepting higher unemployment, or allowing recession to bring the balance of payments into equilibrium. But the political costs of such austerity were high, perhaps unacceptable. Alternatively, the United States could abandon gold convertibility, allowing the dollar to find its own level against other currencies, freed from the constraint of the gold link. This would be admitting that the post-war monetary order was unsustainable, that the architecture so carefully constructed at Bretton Woods needed to be rebuilt. The decision would fall to Richard Nixon, who entered the presidency in January of 1969, inheriting an economic situation that was deteriorating steadily. Nixon's economic advisers debated the options, some arguing for defending the dollar and the gold link at all costs, others suggesting that the Bretton Woods system had outlived its usefulness and should be abandoned before it collapsed on its own. The pressure mounted month by month, the gold reserves declining, the foreign dollar holdings growing, the gap between the two becoming impossible to ignore. Through 1970 and into 1971, speculation against the dollar intensified. Currency traders and central banks anticipated that the dollar might be devalued, or that gold convertibility might be suspended. When such expectations take hold, they become self-fulfilling. People rush to exchange dollars for gold or for other currencies before the expected change occurs, accelerating the very crisis they anticipate. The Federal Reserve and Treasury struggled to maintain order, but the fundamental imbalance could not be wished away through determination or clever intervention. The Bretton Woods system, which had seemed so solid and permanent just a decade earlier, was approaching its end. The quarter-century of fixed exchange rates and dollar-gold convertibility had brought unprecedented prosperity and stability to international trade, but it had also contained internal contradictions, tensions between domestic and international goals, between the needs of the American economy and the needs of the global monetary system. Those contradictions, identified by Robert Triffin but ignored in the comfortable assumption that American power could sustain any burden, were now forcing a reckoning. The dollar stood at a crossroads, about to undergo its most fundamental transformation since the creation of the Federal Reserve, perhaps since the Coinage Act of 1792. The gold link that had defined monetary value for centuries, that had survived in modified form, through wars and depressions and the creation of central banks, was about to be severed finally and completely. What would replace it? What would anchor the dollar's value once the gold anchor was cut? Remained uncertain as the summer of 1971 approached. The system that had seemed permanent was about to discover that in monetary affairs, as in so much of life, nothing endures forever without adaptation and change. On Sunday evening, August 15th, 1971, President Nixon appeared on television to address the nation about economic policy. It was an unusual time for such an address, interrupting regular programming, suggesting the importance of what he had to say. Nixon spoke for about 20 minutes, announcing a series of measures that he called a new economic policy. Among these measures, buried somewhat in the middle of the speech, was a statement that would fundamentally alter the global monetary system. The United States was suspending temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The announcement was carefully phrased, describing the suspension as a defensive measure against speculators who were attacking the dollar. Nixon spoke of the need to protect American workers and American jobs from unfair international competition. He announced wage and price controls to combat inflation and tariffs on imports to encourage domestic production. But the gold decision was the heart of the matter, the change that would echo through decades. After that Sunday evening, foreign central banks could no longer exchange their dollars for gold at the official price. The gold window, as it came to be called, was closed. The decision had been made at a secret meeting at Camp David, the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains, over the preceding weekend. Nixon's economic advisers had debated the options urgently, knowing that the monetary crisis could not be postponed much longer. The gold reserve was declining rapidly as foreign central banks presented dollars for redemption. Something had to be done, and the available choices had narrowed to abandoning gold or accepting severe deflation to defend it. Nixon chose to abandon gold, a decision that was presented as temporary, but that everyone involved understood would likely be permanent. Financial markets around the world convulsed when they reopened after the weekend. Currency trading halted in many countries as the authorities tried to determine how to respond. Stock markets gyrated, initially falling on uncertainty before recovering as investors realized that American companies might benefit from a weaker dollar. Gold prices surged in free markets as the metal's link to official currencies was broken. The Bretton Woods system, already under severe strain, had effectively ended with that Sunday evening announcement. The international community attempted to salvage something from the wreckage. In December of 1971, finance ministers from major nations gathered at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington to negotiate a new arrangement. The Smithsonian Agreement, as it was called, revalued currencies against the dollar, with the dollar effectively devalued relative to gold. The official gold price was raised from $35 per ounce to $38 per ounce, though this was largely symbolic since gold was no longer actually being exchanged at the official price. Exchange rates were adjusted, with the Japanese yen and German mark appreciating significantly against the dollar. The agreement allowed currencies to fluctuate within wider bands around their central rates, providing more flexibility than the rigid Bretton Woods pegs. President Nixon hailed the Smithsonian Agreement as the greatest monetary accord in history. But it was a temporary expedient, an attempt to maintain fixed exchange rates in a world that had outgrown them. The fundamental problems remained. The United States was still running deficits, still creating dollars faster than other nations wanted to hold them, still unable to maintain a fixed gold price. By March of 1973, the Smithsonian Agreement had collapsed. Major currencies began to float freely, their values determined by supply and demand in foreign exchange markets rather than by official pegs. The transition to floating exchange rates was disorienting for a world that had known fixed rates for a generation. Exchange rates that had been stable for years now changed daily, sometimes by significant amounts. Businesses engaged in international trade faced new uncertainties, unsure what their foreign revenues or costs would be worth when converted to their home currency. Banks and financial institutions developed new tools for managing currency risk, forward contracts, and options that allowed traders to lock in exchange rates for future transactions. A whole new layer of financial complexity emerged to deal with the uncertainty that floating rates created. The dollar, freed from the gold constraint, now floated against other currencies. Its value was determined by the supply of dollars and the demand for them, by the relative strength of the American economy, by interest rate differentials with other countries, by perceptions of political stability and economic competence. The dollar could strengthen or weaken, and those movements would have real effects on trade, investment, and living standards. A strong dollar made imports cheaper for Americans but hurt exporters who found their goods more expensive in foreign markets. A weak dollar had the opposite effects, helping exporters but raising the cost of imported goods. To help track these movements, the Federal Reserve created the US Dollar Index in 1973, a weighted average of the dollar's value against a basket of major currencies. The index provided a single number that summarized the dollar's overall strength or weakness, making it easier to discuss and analyze currency movements. The index would fluctuate considerably over the following decades, reflecting the dollar's journey through periods of weakness and strength. The 1970s proved to be a difficult decade for the dollar and for the American economy more broadly. Inflation, which had been creeping upward in the late 60s, accelerated through the 70s, reaching levels not seen in peacetime since the end of the Civil War. Prices rose year after year, eroding the purchasing power of wages and savings, creating uncertainty that undermined economic planning. The inflation had multiple causes. Government spending on Vietnam and domestic programs had created fiscal deficits that were financed partly through monetary expansion. The end of the gold standard removed a constraint on money creation, allowing the Federal Reserve greater freedom that it perhaps used too liberally. And external shocks, particularly in oil markets, contributed significantly to the problem. In October of 1973, war broke out in the Middle East as Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. The war was brief but consequential. Arab oil-producing nations, angry at Western support for Israel, imposed an embargo on oil exports to the United States and other countries. The embargo lasted only about 5 months, but it sent oil prices soaring. A barrel of oil that had cost roughly $3 before the embargo was selling for nearly $12 by March of 1974. Since oil was essential to modern economies, used in transportation and manufacturing and heating, this price shock rippled through everything, raising costs throughout the economy. The combination of rising unemployment and rising inflation created a condition that economists called stagflation, a portmanteau of stagnation and inflation. Traditional economic theory suggested that inflation and unemployment should move in opposite directions, one rising as the other fell. But in the 1970s, both rose together, creating a puzzle that challenged conventional wisdom and left policymakers uncertain about the right response. Fighting inflation typically required tight monetary policy that would slow the economy and increase unemployment. But with unemployment already high, such medicine seemed difficult to swallow. The dollar weakened significantly during the 1970s as inflation eroded its purchasing power and as foreign investors lost confidence in American economic management. The dollar index, which had begun at 100 in 1973, fell to around 85 by the end of the decade. Foreign central banks that held large quantities of dollars in their reserves watched unhappily as the value of those holdings declined relative to other currencies. The dollar's weakness was both a symptom of America's economic difficulties and a contributor to them, since it made imports more expensive and fed into the inflationary spiral. A second oil shock struck in 1979 when revolution in Iran disrupted that nation's oil production. Prices surged again, more than doubling from roughly $15 per barrel in 1978 to over $35 by 1980. The American economy, already struggling, faced another wave of inflation as energy costs rose. Public frustration with economic conditions was mounting, and the political pressure on policymakers to do something, almost anything, became intense. In August of 1979, President Jimmy Carter appointed a new chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Paul Volcker was a tall, imposing figure, a career public servant who had worked at the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, who understood monetary policy deeply and who possessed the determination to make hard choices. Volcker believed that inflation had to be conquered, that the Federal Reserve had been too accommodating for too long, that only a sustained period of tight money could break the inflationary psychology that had taken hold. He was prepared to accept a recession as the price of restoring price stability. Volcker's Federal Reserve raised interest rates sharply in late 1979 and kept them high through the early 1980s. The federal funds rate, the interest rate that banks charge each other for overnight loans and that the Fed influences directly, rose above 20% in mid-1981. These were extraordinary levels, the highest in American history, rates that made borrowing prohibitively expensive for most purposes. Mortgage rates followed the federal funds rate upward, reaching 18% or more, effectively shutting down the housing market. Business investment collapsed as the cost of capital soared. The economy contracted sharply. The recession that Volcker's policies induced was severe. Unemployment rose above 10% in 1982, the highest rate since the Depression. Factories closed. Businesses failed. And the human cost of the disinflationary policy was substantial. But inflation began to decline. After reaching more than 13% in 1980, measured by the Consumer Price Index, inflation fell to less than 4% by 1983. The back of the inflationary spiral had been broken, though the process had been painful. The dollar strengthened dramatically during the Volcker years. High interest rates attracted foreign capital, seeking the generous returns available on dollar-denominated assets. The dollar index rose from around 85 in 1979 to peak near 160 in early 1985, an appreciation of nearly 90%. A strong dollar made imports cheaper, helping to restrain inflation, but it devastated American exporters who found their goods priced out of foreign markets. Farmers struggled as agricultural commodity prices, denominated in dollars, fell in other currencies. Manufacturers faced withering competition from imports that had become remarkably inexpensive. By 1985, the political pressure to do something about the strong dollar had become irresistible. The Reagan administration, working with finance ministers and central bank governors from Japan, Germany, France, and Britain, negotiated an agreement to coordinate currency intervention. The Plaza Accord, named for the Plaza Hotel in New York where the agreement was signed in September of 1985, committed these nations to drive down the value of the dollar. Central banks would sell dollars and buy other currencies, shifting the supply and demand balance. The agreement worked, perhaps too well. The dollar declined sharply over the following years, falling from its 1985 peak to much more modest levels by 1987. The experience of the 1970s and 80s taught important lessons about managing a fiat currency, money that has value only because the government declares it so, and people trust that declaration. Without the discipline of a gold standard, without the automatic constraint that convertibility imposed, monetary authorities had to provide discipline themselves. They had to resist the temptation to create money too freely, to inflate away problems, to pursue short-term political goals at the expense of long-term stability. Volcker's Federal Reserve had shown that such discipline was possible, but also that it came at a cost that democracies might not always be willing to pay. The dollar as pure fiat money, untethered from gold, was an experiment that had no historical precedent on this scale. Previous attempts at fiat currency, from the continental currency to the French assignats to various other experiments, had often ended in inflation or collapse. But the dollar, backed by the productive capacity of the American economy and managed by a Federal Reserve that had learned painful lessons, survived the test. Inflation was conquered, confidence was restored, and the dollar emerged from the crucible of the 1970s and early 80s as a stronger currency than before. The late 1980s and 1990s brought a long period of relative stability and prosperity. Inflation remained low, growth was steady if not spectacular, and the dollar traded in a range that facilitated international commerce without creating major distortions. The Federal Reserve, led by Alan Greenspan after 1987, managed monetary policy with a light touch, adjusting interest rates in small increments to keep the economy growing without overheating. On October 19, 1987, the stock market experienced its largest one-day percentage decline in history, falling more than 22%. Black Monday, as it came to be known, sent shockwaves through financial markets worldwide. But the Federal Reserve responded quickly, flooding the banking system with liquidity and lowering interest rates to prevent a credit crunch. The intervention worked. The crisis passed without triggering a broader economic downturn, and the dollar remained stable despite the financial turmoil. It was a demonstration of how effective central banking could be when wielded skillfully. The end of the Cold War in 1989 and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union confirmed the United States as the world's sole superpower. American economic and political models seemed vindicated by history, and the dollar's status as the dominant international currency was, if anything, strengthened. As former communist nations transitioned to market economies, they naturally turned to the dollar as a stable store of value and medium of exchange. The dollar's reach extended into regions where it had previously been unwelcome or prohibited. In 1997, financial crisis struck Asia, beginning in Thailand and spreading rapidly to Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, and other nations. Currencies collapsed, stock markets plunged, and economies that had been growing rapidly contracted sharply. The crisis revealed weaknesses in Asian financial systems, excessive borrowing in foreign currencies, and the dangers of fixed exchange rates in a world of mobile capital. But it also demonstrated the dollar's role as a safe haven. When crisis struck, investors fled to dollar assets, driving up the dollar's value and providing the United States with easy financing of its deficits, even as much of the world struggled. The 1990s also saw the introduction of the euro, the first serious competitor to the dollar, as an international currency since the pound sterling's decline. 11 European nations adopted the euro in 1999, replacing their national currencies with a common money managed by the new European Central Bank. The euro was not physically circulated until January of 2002, when bills and coins replaced francs and marks and lira in daily transactions. But from 1999 onward, the euro existed as an accounting unit and a potential alternative to the dollar for international reserves and transactions. Some observers predicted that the euro would quickly rival or even surpass the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. Europe's economy was roughly as large as America's, and a unified European currency would have the scale and liquidity necessary for international use. But the dollar maintained its dominant position, partly through inertia and established practice, partly because the United States remained the world's most dynamic economy, and partly because the euro faced challenges in establishing its credibility. The dollar accounted for roughly 60% of global central bank reserves at the end of the 1990s, a share that had declined only modestly from its peak despite the euro's introduction. As the year 2000 approached, there was brief anxiety about Y2K, the fear that computers programmed with two-digit year codes would malfunction when the calendar rolled from 1999 to 2000. Financial systems, which relied heavily on computers, seemed particularly vulnerable. Banks and other institutions spent billions updating their software, and the Federal Reserve prepared to provide extra liquidity if needed. The transition passed smoothly, the feared disruptions largely failing to materialize. But the episode demonstrated how dependent the monetary system had become on technology, how much the dollar had evolved from a physical thing into an electronic abstraction. The dollar at the millennium was something that would have been almost unrecognizable to the framers who had debated the Coinage Act of 1792. It was no longer defined in terms of gold or silver. It could not be exchanged for precious metal at a government window. Its value fluctuated daily against other currencies, determined by markets rather than by official decree. Most dollars existed only as electronic entries in computer systems, transferred at the speed of light rather than carried in wagons or ships. Physical currency, paper bills and metal coins remained important for daily transactions, but the majority of dollar value existed in an abstract realm of bank deposits and digital records. Yet for all these changes, the dollar remained what it had always been at its core: a promise, a unit of account, a medium of exchange, a store of value. People trusted it because they believed others would accept it, because they had confidence in the American economy and government, because generations of experience had shown that the dollar, for all its fluctuations and challenges, retained value over time. The journey from colonial chaos to global dominance had been long and not always smooth, but the dollar had adapted to each challenge, evolved with each crisis, and emerged as the closest thing the world had to a universal currency. The new century would bring new tests, new technologies, new competitors, but the dollar would continue its journey, shaped by the choices of policymakers and the trust of billions of people who used it every day. The new millennium began with optimism shading into excess. The internet, which had transformed from a research tool into a commercial platform during the 1990s, seemed to promise unlimited growth and prosperity. Companies with little more than a website and a business plan attracted billions in investment. Stock prices for technology firms soared to levels that bore little relationship to current earnings or even plausible future profits. The enthusiasm was genuine, the potential of the new technology real, but the valuations had lost touch with underlying reality. The bubble burst in the year 2000, as bubbles eventually do. The Nasdaq index, heavy with technology stocks, peaked in March and then fell steadily through the following months. Companies that had been valued at billions disappeared or shrank to tiny fractions of their former worth. Investors who had watched their portfolios soar discovered that paper wealth could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. The recession that followed was relatively mild by historical standards, but it marked the end of the exuberant expansion of the late 90s. The dollar remained stable through this transition, neither strengthening dramatically nor collapsing. The Federal Reserve under Alan Greenspan's continued leadership lowered interest rates to cushion the economy's fall, providing easier credit to encourage spending and investment. The response seemed measured, calibrated to the scale of the problem, and the economy began recovering by late 2001. Then came September 11, 2001, when terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. The immediate disruption to financial markets was severe. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 4 days, the longest such closure since the Depression. When markets reopened, share prices fell sharply as investors grappled with the implications of the attacks and the uncertainty they had created. But the dollar, perhaps surprisingly, strengthened in the aftermath. Foreign capital flowed into dollar assets, seeking the safety of American Treasury securities, even as the nation grappled with unprecedented attacks. The pattern revealed something important about the dollar's role in the global financial system. In times of crisis and uncertainty, investors around the world sought refuge in dollar-denominated assets, particularly United States government bonds. The dollar was not just a currency but a haven, the place where frightened money went to hide. The early years of the 2000s saw housing prices rise steadily, then rapidly, then unsustainably. Low interest rates, maintained by the Federal Reserve to support economic recovery, made mortgages affordable and encouraged borrowing. Financial innovations allowed lenders to package mortgages into securities that could be sold to investors, spreading risk but also obscuring it. Standards for lending relaxed as competition among lenders intensified. People who might not have qualified for mortgages in earlier times found credit readily available. Housing prices rose because credit was easy, and credit remained easy because rising prices made mortgages seem safe. By 2006, some observers were warning that housing prices had become disconnected from fundamental values, that a correction was inevitable. But predicting when a bubble will burst is notoriously difficult, and many participants in the market believe that housing prices could only rise, that real estate was a safe investment that would never fail. The faith proved misplaced. Housing prices peaked in 2006 and began to fall in 2007. The decline accelerated through 2008 as it became clear that millions of mortgages would never be fully repaid, that the securities backed by those mortgages were worth far less than their face value, that the financial institutions holding these securities faced catastrophic losses. Banks that had seemed solid revealed themselves to be dangerously undercapitalized. The investment bank Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy in September of 2008. The insurance giant AIG required a government rescue to avoid collapse. The financial system, which had seemed so sophisticated and resilient, teetered on the edge of complete breakdown. The Federal Reserve and Treasury responded with extraordinary measures. Interest rates were cut to near zero. The Federal Reserve created programs to lend directly to banks and other financial institutions, providing liquidity when normal credit channels had frozen. The Treasury injected capital into major banks, effectively nationalizing them temporarily to prevent their failure. Congress passed legislation providing $700 billion for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, intended to purchase troubled securities and shore up the financial system. These interventions were controversial, seen by some as necessary to prevent catastrophe, and by others as bailouts for institutions that had behaved recklessly and should have been allowed to fail. The debate echoed old arguments about moral hazard, about whether rescuing failed institutions encouraged future recklessness by removing the consequences of bad decisions. But the immediate concern was preventing the financial crisis from spiraling into a second Great Depression. The dollar once again strengthened during the crisis. The dollar index rose significantly in late 2008 as frightened investors around the world sought dollar assets. It seemed paradoxical. The crisis had originated in the United States. American financial institutions were at the center of the troubles, yet the dollar was strengthening rather than weakening. The pattern confirmed the dollar's unique role as the global safe haven, the currency that benefited from fear, even when that fear was focused on American problems. With conventional interest rate policy exhausted, rates already at zero and unable to go meaningfully lower, the Federal Reserve turned to a tool that had been discussed theoretically but never used on such a scale. Quantitative easing, as it came to be called, involved the Federal Reserve purchasing large quantities of government bonds and mortgage-backed securities, paying for them by creating new money in the form of bank reserves. Between 2008 and 2014, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from roughly $900 billion to $4.5 trillion, an increase that represented the creation of more than $3.5 trillion in new reserves. Critics warned that this enormous expansion of the monetary base would inevitably produce inflation, that creating so much new money would debase the currency and send prices soaring. The warnings echoed concerns from earlier eras, fears that paper money unmoored from gold would inevitably lose value. But the predicted inflation did not materialize, at least not in consumer prices. The new money remained largely in the banking system as excess reserves, not flowing through to the broader economy in a way that would drive up prices of goods and services. Inflation remained subdued, below the Federal Reserve's target of 2% for most of the period. The Great Recession officially ended in mid-2009, but recovery was slow and frustrating. Unemployment remained elevated for years, declining only gradually from its peak above 10%. The economy grew, but not robustly, leaving many workers struggling to find jobs that matched their skills and aspirations. The crisis had destroyed substantial wealth, particularly in housing, and the psychological scars took time to heal. People who had lost homes or jobs or savings were understandably cautious about taking on new obligations, and this caution itself slowed the recovery. While the economy struggled, technology was transforming how people used money. Mobile phones became ubiquitous, evolving from simple communication devices into powerful computers that fit in a pocket. Payment systems adapted to this new reality. Services like Venmo and PayPal allowed people to transfer money with a few taps on a screen. Retailers installed systems that accepted payment from phones, making credit cards seem almost old-fashioned. Cash use declined steadily as electronic payments became easier and more convenient. the dollar increasingly existed as data rather than as physical objects, transferred through networks rather than handed from person to person. In January of 2009, in the depths of the financial crisis, someone using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto released a paper describing a new kind of money. Bitcoin, as it was called, would be entirely digital, created through a process of cryptographic computation, transferred without the need for banks or government intermediaries. The system would be decentralized, with no single authority controlling it, no central bank adjusting its supply. The number of bitcoins would be strictly limited by the protocol itself, making inflation impossible. It was a vision of money that challenged the existing system, that questioned whether government-issued fiat currency was really necessary. Bitcoin attracted a small but devoted following at first, enthusiasts who appreciated its technological elegance and its libertarian philosophy. The first real-world Bitcoin transaction occurred in May of 2010, when someone paid 10,000 Bitcoins for 2 pizzas, a purchase that would seem absurdly expensive years later when Bitcoin's price had soared. Gradually, Bitcoin gained wider attention. Its price fluctuated wildly, soaring during periods of enthusiasm and crashing during moments of doubt. Other cryptocurrencies emerged, each with variations on the basic concept. The cryptocurrency movement became a phenomenon, attracting billions in investment and inspiring passionate advocacy. Traditional financial institutions and monetary authorities watched cryptocurrencies with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. The Federal Reserve and other central banks studied the technology, trying to understand whether it represented a genuine challenge to government-issued money or a speculative mania that would eventually fade. Cryptocurrencies offered advantages in certain contexts, particularly for international transfers and for people without access to traditional banking, but they also face challenges in achieving wide acceptance, their volatility making them difficult to use as stable stores of value or reliable media of exchange. The dollar, meanwhile, continued to dominate global finance despite predictions of its imminent decline. More than 60% of global foreign exchange reserves were held in dollars in 2010, a share that declined only slightly over the following years. Roughly 88% of all foreign exchange transactions involved the dollar on one side of the trade. Oil and most other major commodities were priced in dollars. When businesses in Japan wanted to buy goods from Brazil, they often settled the transaction in dollars rather than in yen or reals. The dollar's network effects, the advantages that came from everyone else using it, proved remarkably persistent. In late 2019, reports emerged from China of a new respiratory illness. By early 2020, it had become clear that the virus causing COVID-19 could spread easily and cause serious illness in vulnerable populations. Nations around the world imposed lockdowns, closing businesses and restricting movement to slow the virus's spread. The global economy contracted sharply, perhaps more rapidly than at any time since the Depression. Unemployment soared as businesses closed or reduced operations. Stock markets plunged in March of 2020, falling more than 30% before recovering. Governments responded with extraordinary fiscal measures, providing direct payments to citizens, expanding unemployment benefits, and supporting businesses affected by lockdowns. The United States sent checks to most adults, distributed unemployment assistance that exceeded normal wages for many workers, and provided loans to businesses that became grants if used for payroll. The amounts were enormous, measured in trillions of dollars, financed by government borrowing that pushed the federal debt to levels not seen since World War II. The Federal Reserve supported this spending by keeping interest rates at zero and resuming quantitative easing, purchasing government bonds and other securities at a pace that dwarfed the post-2008 programs. The money supply, measured broadly, expanded by roughly 25% in 2020 alone. Much of this increase came from government spending flowing directly into bank accounts, stimulus payments appearing electronically in people's accounts, unemployment benefits deposited digitally. The speed and scale of the monetary expansion would have seemed impossible in earlier eras. Inflation, which had remained subdued for decades, began to rise in 2021. Supply chains disrupted by the pandemic struggled to meet demand from consumers who had accumulated savings during lockdowns. Energy prices rose as the economy reopened. Labour shortages in certain sectors pushed wages higher. By 2022, inflation had reached levels not seen since the early 1980s, approaching 9%. The Federal Reserve responded by raising interest rates sharply, faster than at any time in recent history, attempting to cool demand without triggering a severe recession. The transition was uncomfortable, a reminder that managing a fiat currency required constant attention and difficult trade-offs. Central banks around the world began studying the possibility of creating their own digital currencies. Government-issued money that would exist only electronically, but would have the backing and stability of traditional currency. These central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, would combine some advantages of cryptocurrencies with the reliability of government money. The Federal Reserve explored a digital dollar, though implementation remained uncertain. The technology existed, the concept was sound, but questions remained about privacy, about how such a system would interact with existing banks, about what problems it would actually solve. The dollar's future, viewed from the middle of the 2020s, remained secure in its fundamental role, but uncertain in its precise form. Physical cash continued to decline as a share of transactions, though it remained important for certain uses and certain populations. Digital payments expanded, making money transfer as simple as sending a text message. Cryptocurrencies established themselves as a permanent if niche part of the financial landscape, an alternative that some embraced enthusiastically while others regarded with skepticism. And the dollar itself, that unit of account first defined in 1792, continued to evolve, adapting to new technologies and new challenges as it had throughout its long history. The dollar's dominance in international trade and finance showed surprising resilience. Despite recurring predictions that the euro, the yuan, or some other currency would supplant it, the dollar maintained its position at the center of the global monetary system. The reasons were partly practical. Markets for dollar assets were deep and liquid, making it easy to buy or sell large amounts without moving prices significantly. The rule of law in the United States provided protections for property rights that investors valued, and simple inertia played a role, the difficulty of coordinating a shift away from an established standard. But the dollar's position was not guaranteed by nature or destiny. It depended on the choices that Americans and their government made, on whether they managed their economy and finances prudently, on whether they maintained the institutions that inspired trust. Other nations could choose to conduct trade in different currencies, to hold reserves in other assets, to build alternative systems that reduced dependence on the dollar. The dollar remained dominant because people chose to use it, and that choice could change if circumstances change sufficiently. The story of the dollar, from scattered colonial currencies to global reserve currency, demonstrated something important about money itself. Money is not a fixed thing, unchanging and eternal. It evolves constantly, shaped by technology and institutions and collective decisions. What served as money in one era might be replaced in the next, not because the old money failed, but because new circumstances required new solutions. The dollar had adapted repeatedly, from silver and gold coins to paper certificates to electronic entries, changing its form while maintaining its essential function. And so the dollar continues its journey, carried forward by the choices of millions of people who use it every day, managed by institutions that attempt to preserve its value, shaped by forces both domestic and global that push and pull on its worth. The physical dollar you might hold, that piece of cotton linen paper with its familiar green design, represents the end point of centuries of innovation and adaptation, a link in a chain that stretches back through computer networks and central banks and gold vaults to Spanish pieces of 8 and beyond. It is a remarkable continuity, this thread of value and trust, and it persists because enough people believe it will, because confidence, once established, creates its own reality. Perhaps you remember that dollar bill from the beginning of our story, resting somewhere nearby, waiting patiently. If you were to hold it now, it might feel different somehow, heavier with the weight of all those centuries, all those choices made by people trying to solve the eternal puzzle of how to exchange value, how to trust strangers, how to build something lasting. That piece of paper connects you to every person who's ever wondered about money's strange magic, from the first traders counting cowrie shells, to Hamilton drafting his vision, to farmers debating silver, to families navigating the uncertainties of today. You are part of this continuing story, this long conversation about trust and value that humanity has been having with itself for thousands of years. The dollar will keep adapting, keep changing, keep evolving in ways we cannot predict, just as it always has. But that's not your concern tonight. Tonight there is only rest, only the gentle certainty that the story continues whether we watch it or not, that the great slow river of commerce and trust flows on while we sleep. So let it all drift away now, the coins and paper, the gold and the zeros on screens, the whole long history settling like soft snow. There is nothing left to understand, nothing to remember, only the quiet dark and your breathing and sleep.